Hello everyone, and welcome back to Stories for Sleep. I know so many of you use these videos to unwind and drift off, and it truly warms my heart to be part of your nightly routine. Before we dive into tonight's story, I thought it would be wonderful if you could take a moment to leave a comment, letting me know where in the world you're listening from. I'd love to know who and where you are. And of course, if these stories bring you comfort, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. Now let's settle in, take a deep breath, sink into the coziness of this moment, and let your mind begin to relax. Close your eyes, feel the tension leave your body, and let's begin. When Ben moved into the old house on Pine Street, it felt like a new chapter in his life. A fresh start, a break from the monotony of city living, and the heavy weight of his past. He had recently come out of a long-term relationship, a slow burn of disappointment that left him questioning everything. So when the opportunity to buy the house, cheap and perfect for a solitary man like him, arose, he took it without hesitation. It had that quiet charm, the kind you only find in homes that had been forgotten by time. The house was a sprawling two-story relic, its pale blue paint chipped and faded, the windows lined with dust. Despite its age, it stood proudly among the trees at the edge of town, as though daring anyone to approach. The previous owners had left without much of a word. The realtor, an elderly woman who barely spoke above a whisper, had been the one to show him around. She had mentioned something about the house being a bit quiet, but quickly dismissed it with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Ben didn't think much of it at the time. The first few days were uneventful. Ben had spent most of his time unpacking, getting used to the creaks and groans of the house, familiarizing himself with the oddities, like the steep staircase leading to the attic that seemed almost too steep for comfort, and the old fireplace that had clearly not seen a fire in decades. He found a couple of strange, outdated objects hidden away in the corners, an old rocking chair in the attic, a tarnished brass lamp in the living room. But nothing was particularly alarming. Then came the bathroom mirror. It wasn't something that caught his attention at first. It was just a regular mirror, square, framed in dark wood. It hung above the bathroom sink like any other. But on the third night, as Ben brushed his teeth, something strange happened. He had been brushing quickly, getting ready for bed, when he heard it, a faint whisper, barely a murmur in the back of his mind. He froze, toothbrush halfway to his mouth. His eyes darted to the mirror, and for a moment he thought maybe it was his imagination. The sound came again, soft, barely audible, like someone was speaking just out of earshot. Ben. The whisper was barely more than a breath, but it was clear enough. He turned, but there was no one there. "Just the wind," he muttered to himself, chuckling nervously. It was a large, old house after all. It creaked and groaned, and the wind did strange things to the wooden floors at night. He finished brushing his teeth, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. That night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't shake the unsettling sensation of the whisper. It had been so clear, so insistent, but it didn't seem to make sense. Why would someone whisper to him in a house he had just moved into? Maybe the previous owners had some old habit. Strange murmurs in the night were nothing new to houses like this. He tried to convince himself of that. The following days were similarly quiet. The house was still, save for the occasional sound of pipes groaning or the wind rattling the window panes. Ben had managed to get comfortable in his new home despite the lingering unease. But every time he passed the bathroom mirror, he found himself glancing into it, half expecting to see something, someone watching him. It was foolish, he told himself. The house was old, and his mind was playing tricks on him. Then on the seventh night, the whisper returned. This time it was louder, more distinct. As Ben stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection, he heard it again, clear as day. "Come closer." Ben's heart skipped a beat. He turned sharply, his eyes wide. The bathroom door was closed as it had been. There was no one behind him. The house was still. The voice. It was as if it had come from the mirror itself. His reflection remained unchanged, but his skin prickled, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The mirror had become an object of dread. He had been imagining things, surely. He was exhausted from unpacking, from trying to make this place feel like home. The tension of the move, the loneliness. Maybe it had finally gotten to him. He stepped away from the mirror, shaking his head. He made himself a cup of coffee and tried to forget it, but sleep wouldn't come easily that night. The following evening, as Ben settled in for the night, the whisper returned, louder this time, almost urgent. "Come closer." The words echoed in his mind, reverberating with a strange, eerie resonance. This time there was no question in his mind. He wasn't imagining it. Something was in the mirror, something was calling to him. He tried to ignore it. He told himself it was the house settling, old pipes expanding and contracting, or perhaps the wind rustling through the trees outside. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. The next day, Ben tried to go about his business. He worked from home, his computer screen providing a temporary distraction from the overwhelming sense of unease that had taken over the house. But no matter how hard he tried to focus, his mind kept drifting back to the whispering voice. It haunted him in quiet moments, in the spaces between thoughts. That night, he couldn't help himself. He found himself walking back to the bathroom, standing in front of the mirror once again. His reflection stared back at him. Dark, tired eyes, the shadows of a man who had seen better days. His heart beat faster as he waited for the voice. For a long while there was nothing, no whisper, just the sound of his own breathing in the silence. Then softly, as if the mirror itself was drawing him in, the whisper came again. "Come closer." Ben's hands trembled as he reached out, his fingers grazing the cold glass. There was an odd sensation, a pulling, as if the mirror itself was alive, breathing in the same air as him. His pulse raced as the darkness in the reflection seemed to shift, as though the mirror was no longer simply showing his image, but something more, something otherworldly. For a moment, Ben considered stepping back, leaving the bathroom and pretending none of this had ever happened. But curiosity, that insidious thing, gnawed at him. What could it possibly mean? Why was the mirror calling to him? Before he could pull away, the whisper came again, louder and more insistent this time. "Come closer." And then, as if on instinct, Ben did. He leaned forward, his forehead now just inches from the cold glass, the air between him and the mirror thick with dread. He felt it, a chill, like a draft coming from deep within the glass, as if the mirror was a window into some other place. He could see the reflection of his eyes, wide and filled with uncertainty, staring back at him, but there was something else, something moving behind his reflection, a shadow flickering in the corner of the mirror. Ben's breath caught in his throat. "Ben!" The voice whispered again, this time soft and clear, like a soft breath in his ear. And then everything went black. When Ben woke, he was no longer in the bathroom. The first thing he noticed was the overwhelming sense of confusion. His head ached, a dull throb that pulsed with each heartbeat. His mouth was dry, his lips cracked, and his fingers felt cold to the touch. He blinked rapidly, his eyes adjusting to the darkness around him. He wasn't in his house anymore. This wasn't his bathroom. The air was thick, stale, and smelled of dampness, musty wood, decay, and something faintly metallic that he couldn't place. The faint light of what appeared to be a flickering candle cast distorted shadows across the walls. The walls themselves seemed to shift as if they were alive, breathing in time with his shallow breaths. He stood slowly, his legs unsteady, and reached out to steady himself on what appeared to be a table. A sharp, almost electric sensation ran through his fingers as he touched it, and he pulled his hand back instinctively. His heart was pounding now, his breath quick and shallow. The ground beneath him felt uneven, as though the room itself were tilting slowly. Ben's mind raced. What had just happened? One moment, he had been standing in front of the mirror, the cold glass beckoning him closer, the voice urging him forward. And then everything went dark. Had he fainted? Had he somehow hit his head? But no, that didn't explain the feeling of unreality around him. The fact that he was no longer in the comfort of his home, the warmth of his bathroom, where he could have sworn he was just moments ago. He glanced around, straining his eyes to adjust to the dim lighting. There was something wrong. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper that peeled and crumbled at the edges, the patterns like something from a forgotten age, twisting vines, flowers that had lost their color, and small, cryptic symbols scattered here and there. It looked as though this room had been abandoned for decades, forgotten in the crevices of time. But it was more than just the appearance of the place. There was a palpable sense of wrongness, a deep, visceral unease that clung to him like a second skin. The longer he stayed still, the more it suffocated him. The very air was heavier here, as if it were pressing in on him from all sides. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice barely breaking the silence. The words felt strange, as if they didn't belong to him. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted again. But they weren't shadows, not really. They were figures. Ben froze, his heart hammering in his chest as he blinked, trying to make sense of the shapes at the edges of his vision. The figures moved ever so slightly, their outlines blurring in the candlelight. The closer he looked, the more he could discern. Pale, gaunt faces, their eyes hollow and black, staring at him with an intensity that made his stomach lurch. The figures had no bodies, just limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally, reaching out, searching for something. For him. His breath caught in his throat, panic setting in. This was no longer a dream, no longer something he could explain away. He was trapped somewhere that felt ancient, twisted. He had seen these things before in the corners of his peripheral vision, flickering just out of focus. They had followed him from the mirror. They were watching him now. He scrambled to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. Every instinct screamed for him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The room, the space, seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions, the walls too far away to touch, the air too thick to breathe. And then a sound broke through the silence, a whisper, soft, familiar, coming from just behind him. "Ben!" It was the same voice, the voice from the mirror. His spine stiffened, cold dread pooling in his gut. He didn't need to turn around. He knew it was there, whatever it was, right behind him. But his body refused to obey, frozen in place, every muscle tense and locked. His breath hitched in his chest as he slowly turned, ever so slowly, to face whatever horror had drawn him into this place. The figure behind him was no longer a shadow. It was a woman, if you could even call it that. Her skin was pale, impossibly pale, her face gaunt and hollow-eyed, like something long dead. Her hair hung in wet strands around her face, clinging to her like cobwebs. She didn't have a mouth, not really, but her lips were stretched in an unnatural way, twisted into a thin, permanent line. Her eyes, dark and endless, locked with his. "Why did you come?" she whispered, her voice low and distorted, like 1,000 voices speaking at once, all jumbled and broken. Ben's heart raced. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. There was a tightness in his chest, constriction in his throat that prevented him from answering. The silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the slow, rhythmic sound of his panicked breathing. The woman's head tilted slightly to one side, as though she were studying him, assessing him. Then, in a movement so swift it seemed unnatural, she reached out, her long, skeletal fingers brushing against his arm. Ben flinched, his entire body recoiling from the touch. The cold that emanated from her fingers was more than just temperature. It was as though the touch had seeped into his very bones, freezing him from the inside out. A numbness spread through him, as if the woman's touch had drained all the warmth, all the life from him. The room seemed to pulse, the air thick with her presence. The woman's lips parted, and for a brief moment Ben thought he saw a smile that wasn't hers. It was something else, something worse. Then, just as quickly, she was gone, vanished, disappeared into the shadows that seemed to pull away from the walls, leaving only the flickering candlelight behind. Ben stood there, his legs like rubber beneath him. The figures in the corners of the room were gone, their dark shapes retreating into nothingness. The air was still, too still, and yet something hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. A promise, a warning. He couldn't stay here. He needed to leave. But leave where? Where could he go? How could he even begin to escape this twisted place when everything around him seemed so wrong? And then the whisper came again, closer this time, just behind his ear. "Come closer." Ben's blood ran cold. He had thought it would be impossible to feel more trapped than he already did. But now the whisper wasn't just a voice. It was a force, a pull, an invisible thread tugging at him, pulling him in the direction of something he couldn't see, something he didn't understand. His feet moved, as if against his will, drawing him toward the center of the room. The shadows swirled around him, cold fingers brushing against his skin, dragging him closer to whatever waited in the darkness. His mind screamed for him to stop, to fight it. But the whisper, the voice, was growing louder, stronger. "Come closer." Ben's breath caught in his throat as his hand reached out, drawn by the voice. The moment his fingers touched the edge of the table in front of him, everything went dark once again. The world shifted violently, as if the very fabric of reality were tearing apart, and he was being swallowed whole. When Ben awoke again, the disorienting weight of reality, if you could even call it that, crushed down on him with an unbearable force. He felt like he was floating, lost in a sea of blackness, his body numb, his mind clouded. For a brief, terrifying moment, he couldn't tell whether he was still inside the house, trapped within the confines of the mirror's dark grip, or if he had slipped entirely out of existence. His eyes fluttered open, and he was met with an overwhelming sense of vertigo. His stomach churned, as if he had just been pulled from the deepest part of a nightmare and thrust back into the waking world. The surroundings felt different, yet oddly familiar, as though he had known this place in some other life, some other time. But it was wrong. It was all wrong. He lay on something soft, almost too soft, like old fabric, heavy with the weight of age and neglect. As he slowly pushed himself up, his body protesting the effort, he noticed that the air smelled thicker here, richer, heavier, a scent of mildew, rotting wood, and something else, something faintly metallic, like rust. His fingers scraped against the material beneath him. It was cold, cold as ice. He looked around. The room was dark, but not in the comforting, familiar way of nighttime. It was dark, as if the very essence of light had been drained from this place. The walls were closer now, suffocating. Their once distinct patterns now obscured by layers of grime and decay. The very structure of the room seemed unstable, the air sagging with the heaviness of something old and forgotten. His heart skipped a beat as his eyes landed on something that stood in the center of the room, something that had not been there before. It was a figure, tall and thin, shrouded in shadow. The figure was completely still, yet Ben felt the sensation of being watched, the pressure of unseen eyes weighing down on him from all sides. He couldn't tell who or what it was, but he knew without a doubt that this thing, whatever it was not something he wanted to meet. Without thinking, his feet carried him forward, driven by the primal urge to move, to escape. But the moment he shifted, the figure moved as well, slowly, almost languidly, as if it had been waiting for him. Its presence was suffocating, the thick fog rolling in from every corner of the room, creeping into his chest and tightening his lungs. A cold shiver ran down his spine as the figure finally spoke. "Ben." The voice was distorted, just like the woman's voice had been before, broken and hollow, as though it had been dragged through the deep end of the abyss. But this time, it wasn't just a whisper. No, this time the voice echoed through his mind, reverberating against the walls of his skull, filling every crevice with dread. The figure's eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, but they weren't human eyes. No, these were eyes of pure blackness, voids that seemed to suck in all light, as if they could devour the very soul that looked into them. Ben stumbled backward, his legs giving way beneath him, the ground suddenly feeling like a jagged edge beneath his feet. He tried to stand, but his body wouldn't cooperate, his mind clouded by the terror clawing at his insides. "What are you?" Ben croaked, his voice breaking with the effort to speak. The figure didn't move at first, simply standing there in the suffocating darkness. Then, after what felt like an eternity of silence, it spoke again, the words dripping from its lips like poison. "I am what you called." Ben's pulse raced. He didn't know what it meant. He couldn't understand it. But something deep inside him told him that whatever this thing was, whatever it represented, it was not something he was meant to encounter. The voice, low, almost gentle in its malevolence, slithered into his ears, growing louder with each passing second. "You summoned us." Ben's mind reeled. He had summoned something? He hadn't even known what was happening when the mirror had called to him. The whispers, the pull toward the glass. That's when it all started. When the mirror had beckoned him closer, when it had drawn him in with that voice, that damned voice. It hadn't been his imagination. It hadn't been just a trick of the mind. Something had been waiting for him, something ancient, something powerful. And now, here it was. The figure took a step forward, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. A cold draft slid along Ben's skin, freezing him to the bone. He could feel his breath coming out in shallow gasps, each exhale visible in the icy air. He tried to back away, but his legs wouldn't move. His feet were planted firmly to the ground, as if the very room itself had a hold on him. "You were never meant to leave," the figure said, its voice now rising, growing louder, as if the words themselves were tearing at the fabric of reality. "This place is not yours. You do not belong here." Ben's heart thudded violently in his chest, a knot of terror tightening in his throat. He tried again to move, to escape, but it was no use. He was trapped. The walls felt as though they were closing in, pressing against him with crushing force. The shadows in the corners of the room, those black, eyeless figures, had returned, moving closer, their limbs stretching unnaturally as they reached for him. The figure before him tilted its head, a strange, twisted grin spreading across its face. There was nothing human about it, no warmth, no recognition, just an ancient, hollow hunger. "You sought it out, Ben," the figure hissed. "You heard the call, you felt the pull. You thought you could escape, but this world, this place, doesn't let go so easily." Ben's throat constricted, the weight of the words crashing over him like an avalanche. He had been brought here, lured by the whispers, but he hadn't understood, not until now. The mirror, the voice, it was all part of this twisted, alternate reality. A place where time and space bled into one another, where shadows moved and breathed, where the very air itself was steeped in death and forgotten things. "You can't leave. Not now. Not ever." The words echoed in his head, each one carrying with it the weight of 1,000 chains. Ben's breath came in ragged gasps, panic starting to take hold of him. He didn't know what to do, where to go. His body was paralyzed, his mind locked in place by the sheer terror of the thing in front of him. It was a nightmare come to life, and there was no waking up from it. The figure raised its arms slowly, the blackness around them deepening, the shadows crawling toward Ben like hungry tendrils. And then the ground beneath his feet cracked, a deep, resonant rumble shaking the room. Something was shifting, something was changing. Ben was falling, no longer held by the ground. He tumbled into the darkness, the air around him thickening, suffocating him, pulling him deeper into the abyss. He gasped for air, his lungs burning, but there was nothing. The world was swallowing him whole, dragging him into a place where nothing made sense. And somewhere, far away, he heard that familiar whisper again. "Come closer." Ben fell, his body tumbling through darkness, through an endless, disorienting void where the very concept of time and space dissolved. It felt as though he were being pulled from the inside out, his senses overwhelmed by an intense, grinding pressure. His lungs burned for air, but there was none. The more he tried to breathe, the tighter the air became, suffocating him from every direction. There was no up, no down, just an infinite spiral of nothing. And then, with a sudden snap, everything stopped. He crashed hard onto something solid. The impact was jarring, but it barely registered in his fogged mind. He lay there, motionless, unable to do anything but gasp in the stagnant air. He could feel the ground beneath him, rough, jagged like stone. The familiar ache of his body from the fall slowly brought him back to his senses, but only just. His head spun with the disorienting experience, and his mind felt like it was fracturing under the pressure of the unknown. He forced his eyes open, squinting against the dim, eerie light. He couldn't tell where he was, only that it was different. The room was larger now, the walls impossibly high, disappearing into shadows that seemed to stretch into infinity. There was no sign of the figures from before, but he could still feel their presence, lurking just beyond his vision, like a sickness spreading through the space. The atmosphere was thick, oppressive. It clung to him like a tangible weight, the air stale, filled with a sour, metallic tang. The stench of decay hung heavy in the room. A strange, buzzing noise filled the silence, the kind of hum that makes your skin crawl. A low, constant vibration that you could feel in your bones. Ben pushed himself up, shaking. His limbs felt stiff, like he'd been in one position for too long. His chest was tight, his breath shallow and erratic. His eyes darted around, searching for any sign of life, any sign of escape, but all he saw was the sprawling emptiness of the room, stretching out in all directions, claustrophobic despite its vastness. And then, movement, a figure, no, more than one, figures. They were emerging from the shadows, silent, their shapes shifting with unnatural fluidity, stretching and contracting like smoke. They were everywhere now, filling the room with their presence, their hollow eyes locked on him, as though they could see into the very core of his being. The air around him seemed to grow heavier, more suffocating, as their forms materialized from the darkness. Ben's heart slammed against his ribcage. He knew these figures now. He had seen them before in his brief, fragmented glimpses into the depths of this place. They weren't human, not in any way he could understand. They were wrong. Their faces were not faces but voids, empty, hollow pits where eyes should be, just darkness swirling, shifting, pulling you in. Their limbs were elongated and unnaturally thin, bending in impossible directions like they were made of smoke and shadow. And there at the center of them stood the figure that had spoken to him before, the one that had told him he didn't belong here. It was still watching him, its black eyes gleaming faintly in the darkness, that same twisted grin stretched unnaturally across its face. "You should have never come," it hissed, its voice like gravel being ground together. "This world, this place, it is not meant for you." Ben couldn't speak. His throat was dry, his voice stolen by the weight of the terror pressing down on him. But he was burning with questions. Where was he? What was this place? What did the figure mean when it said that this world wasn't meant for him? Before he could gather his thoughts, the figure's arms moved, slowly, deliberately, gesturing around the room. This is the other side, the space between places, the place where lost things linger, where time itself frays and warps. The mirror is only the doorway. Ben's breath hitched. The mirror. He thought back to that moment, the moment the voice from the mirror had called him closer, had drawn him in like an irresistible force. The whispers had been so soft at first, almost imperceptible, but they had become louder, clearer, urging him, beckoning him into the glass. He hadn't understood, not fully. But now, as he stood there, trapped in this strange, oppressive space, he understood all too well. He had been lured here, trapped between two worlds, a prisoner of something far older, far more powerful than anything he could comprehend. "Why am I here?" he managed to croak, his voice cracking from the strain. The figure's smile widened, the darkness of its grin swallowing the space between them. "You are here because you sought what should not be sought. You called us. You called us when you gazed into the mirror. And now..." It paused, the air thick with anticipation. "Now you belong to us." Ben's stomach churned, his pulse racing. The figure was right. He had brought this upon himself, had sought answers to things he didn't fully understand. It wasn't just the mirror that had pulled him in. It was his curiosity, his desire to explore the unknown, to face something beyond the veil of reality. But now he was paying the price. "You cannot leave," the figure said, its voice dropping into a low, mocking whisper. "This is your punishment for daring to look too closely." As if on cue, the shadows around him seemed to pulse, the figures moving closer, their limbs stretching toward him with a sound like scraping metal, their dark eyes boring into him, hungry, relentless. Ben stumbled back, his heart hammering against his chest, every instinct screaming for him to run, but there was nowhere to run. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift again, the walls pressing in closer, the air thinning. It felt like the room itself was breathing, pulsing, contracting like some great monstrous thing. "No," Ben whispered. He shook his head, trying to push the fear away, trying to fight back the crushing hopelessness that threatened to consume him. "I won't stay here." But the words were hollow, as empty as the space around him. His hands trembled at his sides, his legs frozen in place. The dark figures were almost upon him now, their shapes stretching and contorting, growing ever closer, their hollow eyes glowing with a malignant hunger. There was no escape. And then, from the darkness beyond the room, a new sound broke through, the whisper, soft at first, then growing louder. "Come closer." Ben's stomach dropped as he recognized the voice, unmistakable. It was the same voice that had beckoned him from the mirror, the voice that had drawn him here, the voice that now felt like a rope around his neck, pulling him deeper into the abyss. He wanted to fight, he wanted to scream, to resist, but all he could do was stagger forward, his body moving of its own accord, his feet carrying him closer to the source of the whisper, closer to the darkness. Ben couldn't stop himself. His legs moved as if driven by a force far greater than his own will, his body trembling, his chest heaving with panic. The whisper echoed through his mind, dragging him forward with a terrifying inevitability. The room had transformed around him, warping and twisting with each step, as if the very walls were alive, shifting to pull him deeper into the heart of the darkness. The figures moved with him, closing the space, their eyeless gazes following his every move. He could feel their presence now, not just a vague, suffocating sense of being watched, but a tangible pressure, a crushing weight that seemed to press against his chest, his mind, his very soul. They were everywhere and yet nowhere, their forms shifting, their movements fluid, but unnaturally silent. "Come closer." The whisper had become a command, not a mere invitation. Ben's mind screamed for him to stop, to turn around and run, but his body refused to obey. Every inch of him wanted to fight, to tear away from this nightmare, but the force of the pull was too strong, too consuming. The dark figures had surrounded him now, their presence overwhelming, their shapes bending and shifting in the corner of his vision. And then, just when Ben thought he could no longer bear the weight of it all, the room shifted again. The floor beneath him cracked, splitting open like the gaping maw of some monstrous creature. The ground trembled, and Ben felt himself falling, sinking into the abyss, deeper than he'd ever fallen before. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness, swallowed by the same place that had devoured him whole from the very beginning. There was no end to the fall, no bottom, no ground, just endless darkness stretching out before him, wrapping around him like a cloak. Time seemed to stop, and yet the fall continued. His body was weightless, lost to the void. His heart pounded in his chest as his mind fought to grasp onto something, anything familiar, something that might tether him to the world he once knew. But all that was left was this, the endless, suffocating void that seemed to stretch out infinitely before him. And then, without warning, he stopped. The void didn't give way to the cold stone of the room, or the strange, shadowy figures that had surrounded him before. Number, this place, this final descent, was different. It was worse. He found himself standing on a surface that felt wrong. Too solid, too cold. A crackling sound filled the air, like static buzzing in his ears. He reached out instinctively, touching the ground, but the surface seemed to pulse beneath his fingers, as though it was breathing. The more he touched it, the more it felt alive, as if it had been waiting for him. When he looked around, his breath caught in his throat. The landscape that stretched out before him was an impossible mockery of reality. The ground was jagged and broken, as though the earth itself had been torn open, each fissure filled with a deep, black void. The sky above was no sky at all, just a swirling mass of dark clouds, constantly shifting and changing, impossibly dense and full of an unnatural energy. There was no light here, no sun, just the oppressive gloom of a place where time had been forgotten, where nothing existed but the broken pieces of forgotten worlds. and in the distance he could see it, a mirror, standing alone in the center of the desolation. It was the same mirror that had called to him, beckoning him into this place. He could feel it even now, the pull that it had on him, the lure of its dark power. The whispers had led him here, and now he was standing before it once again. But this time there was no going back. The air around the mirror shimmered with a strange energy, as though the very fabric of reality was thinning around it. The whispers were louder now, clearer, almost deafening. They filled his ears, spiraling into his skull like 1,000 voices speaking at once, each one demanding his attention. He could hear his name being called again and again, an unrelenting force that drowned out all other sounds. "Ben, come closer." His feet moved on their own, carrying him toward the mirror, the ground beneath him now slick with something wet, something sticky. He tried to fight it, to resist, but his body wouldn't obey. His legs moved faster, the distance between him and the mirror shrinking with each step. His mind raced. This is it. This is the moment I stop walking and face whatever happens next. He didn't know what awaited him beyond the mirror. He didn't know what kind of twisted hell it had in store, but there was something deep inside him that told him it was too late. There was no escape anymore, no running from the pull, no turning back. The mirror was right in front of him now, its surface gleaming in the darkness. Ben stared at it, unable to tear his eyes away. His reflection stared back at him, but something was wrong. It wasn't quite right. It felt distant, alien, as though it wasn't really him at all. The face in the mirror was twisted, contorted, as if mocking him. And then it happened. The figure in the mirror moved. Not Ben, but the reflection. It twisted, stretching its limbs unnaturally, its face distorting into a grotesque, unnatural smile. The eyes, those empty black voids, shifted, staring out at him from the reflection as if they had come alive. It was no longer a reflection at all, but something else that was calling to him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. He felt his body move of its own accord, as though his feet were glued to the ground, pulling him toward the glass. His hand reached out, trembling, his skin brushing against the cold surface of the mirror. And then, with a terrible, sickening crack, the mirror shattered. But it didn't shatter into glass. Instead, the shards of the mirror exploded outward, splitting into pieces of light, fragments of reality itself, bleeding through the seams. The room, the void, the darkness, all of it began to collapse, folding in on itself, bending and twisting as if it were being consumed by something far greater than Ben could comprehend. And then he was pulled into it. No longer standing in the realm of shadows, no longer aware of the broken, dark landscape that had been his prison. He felt himself falling once again, but this time there was no ground beneath him, no walls, no place to go. Only the relentless pull of the darkness as it consumed him, taking him deeper into a reality that was no longer his own. He could hear the whispers even now, the same voice that had called to him, that had lured him in from the very beginning. Come closer. But now there was nothing left to hear. Only the darkness and the crushing silence. It started with a simple estate sale. Those words always carry the weight of something forgotten, discarded, something that no longer mattered to the ones who had once owned it. For Evan Clark, it was just another Saturday morning. The air was sharp with the bite of autumn, and the streets were quiet, as they often were, before the hustle and bustle of the day fully settled in. He had no intention of finding anything special. A quick browse through an old Victorian house in a dilapidated neighborhood would offer the usual odds and ends: furniture with sagging upholstery, porcelain figurines with chipped faces, the odd painting of fruit that no one could bear to look at twice. But then he saw it. The doll was sitting in the far corner of the room, its glassy eyes peering from behind an old wooden chair. It was old, an antique even, a handcrafted creation, its dress tattered, its hair matted, but still unmistakably beautiful in a way that sent a shiver down his spine. The kind of doll that looked out of place in a world that had long since grown too busy for such things. Something about it was off, though. The face was too pale, the eyes too wide, too lifelike. It wasn't simply the craftsmanship, it was the way it seemed to observe him. There was something unsettling about it. Evan had always had a strange affinity for oddities, the kind of things that most people walked past without a second thought. Old vintage toys and figurines, a strange collection of things that weren't quite real, but also weren't fake enough to be easily dismissed. It was a harmless hobby, or so he thought. He'd been collecting for years, never anything too valuable, never anything dangerous, just things that interested him. But as his eyes locked onto the doll, something stirred inside him. It was the sort of reaction that he couldn't explain. Maybe it was just the lighting, the way the dust particles danced around the room as the sunlight filtered in, or maybe it was just his imagination. But the doll, it seemed to call to him. When he looked around the room for the owner of the estate sale, he found an elderly woman sitting in the back corner, hunched over a pile of old records. She was bent over, her thin, frail fingers skimming through the vinyl as though they were pages of a book she couldn't put down. "Excuse me," Evan called, stepping closer. The woman didn't look up. She seemed lost in thought. "Excuse me, ma'am," Evan repeated, now standing directly in front of her. "How much for that doll over there?" The woman's head slowly lifted, and for a moment he caught a glimpse of her eyes, a stark, unsettling blue, too wide and too bright. She blinked slowly, as if coming out of some kind of trance. "That one," she whispered, her voice thin and crackling. "That's not for sale." Evan froze, an uneasy feeling settling over him. "But it's in the sale pile," he said, gesturing toward the doll. The woman's eyes narrowed, a fleeting flash of something dark passing through them. "It is, and it isn't," she murmured. "It stays here, unless—" She trailed off, almost as if she hadn't meant to say the last part. Evan stepped back, uncertain how to respond. Something about her was off, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had to have it. Maybe it was the way the doll looked at him, or maybe it was the strange urgency in the woman's voice. Either way, he felt a strange pull, an inexplicable urge to make it his. "I'll take it," he said, before he could second-guess himself. The woman didn't argue, though her lips seemed to twitch in a manner Evan couldn't quite place. She simply nodded, and then turned away, returning to her stack of records as though she hadn't spoken to him at all. The doll was his now. By the time Evan got the doll home, the clouds had thickened, casting a grey pallor over everything. He unloaded his finds, setting the doll carefully on a shelf in his study, right next to his collection of other vintage items. But this one felt different. The doll stood out against the others. It wasn't just another curiosity. It felt more like a presence, like it belonged. He stood in front of it, scrutinizing the detail. The dress was made of faded lace, the stitching intricate and careful. But as he peered closer, he noticed the tiniest of movements in the doll's fingers. It was barely perceptible, a slight twitch in one hand. Evan blinked, leaning in closer, his breath catching in his throat. It was gone now, the hand still once more. His mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it had been his imagination. Maybe the way the light fell on the doll made the hand seem to move, just for a second. he laughed to himself, trying to shake off the unease that had crept into his chest. It was a doll, nothing more. But the feeling lingered. That night, as he settled into bed, Evan couldn't help but think about the doll, the way it had looked at him, the strange sensation that it was more alive than any of the others. He found himself staring at the wall, unable to shake the odd sense of foreboding creeping up his spine. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but he barely heard it. His thoughts were consumed by that doll. The next morning, the first thing Evan did was head to the study to check on it. He expected to find it exactly as he had left it, sitting silently on the shelf. But when he entered the room, his heart skipped a beat. The doll was gone. Evan's breath caught in his throat. He scanned the room quickly, but it wasn't there. His mind raced. Had someone broken in? Had someone taken it? He stood frozen for a long moment, trying to think logically. He had been alone all night. The windows were locked. The door was still bolted shut. So where was the doll? And then he heard it. A faint tapping noise, as if something small and light was being knocked against the floor. He turned toward the sound, his heart thudding in his chest. And there, sitting in the middle of the floor, was the doll. It was facing him now. The glassy eyes seemed even more unnerving in the dim morning light. They were wide, unblinking, staring directly at him, the doll's head slightly tilted, as if it was waiting. Evan's blood ran cold as he took a hesitant step toward it. He bent down slowly, his hand trembling as he reached out to pick it up. But just as his fingers brushed the doll's porcelain face, he froze. A sudden chill swept through the room, and the doll's hand twitched again. This time, it wasn't just a flicker. It was a full, deliberate motion, its fingers curled inward, gripping the edge of the floor as though it were preparing to stand up. Evan yanked his hand back, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The doll wasn't supposed to do that. He backed away from it slowly, his mind racing, the room closing in around him. There was a creeping sensation in his gut, a gnawing feeling that this was just the beginning. Something was happening to that doll. Something wrong. Evan couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing control, that the world around him was slowly warping into something he couldn't understand. The doll sat motionless on the floor now, its lifeless eyes staring up at him, but the memory of its movement lingered in the air like a ghost. He stared at it from the doorway, his body frozen in place. He should have felt rational. He should have believed that it was just a trick of the light, or that he had imagined the hand twitching. But there was something about it, something in the way the doll had been positioned, the way it was waiting, like it had known he would be the one to find it. He swallowed hard and stepped into the room, his steps cautious, as if walking toward a wild animal. Every instinct told him to leave it alone, to put the doll back where he had found it, to forget this strange feeling that gnawed at him. But curiosity, damnable, relentless curiosity, pushed him forward. He reached down to pick it up again, but as his fingers touched the doll's delicate porcelain face, the room seemed to grow colder. A chill, like the bite of winter, swept through the air. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. The doll's eyes felt heavier now, as though they were watching him more intently. It was only for a moment, but it was enough. The doll's hand twitched again. It wasn't subtle this time. It curled, the fingers flexing in a slow, deliberate motion, as though the doll was waking from a long sleep. Evan jerked his hand away, his heart hammering in his chest. He stumbled backward, his legs suddenly weak. What was happening? This couldn't be real. There was no way this was real. But as he backed into the wall, he heard the sound. the faint scrape of something dragging across the floor. He whipped his head around. The doll was moving, not much, just the slightest shift, like a doll coming to life, its body turning slightly toward him. But it was enough to send a wave of nausea through Evan's stomach. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, thumping so loud it drowned out all other sounds. He wanted to scream, to run out of the house and never look back, but his legs refused to move. He was rooted to the spot, watching the doll shift again, just a fraction of an inch, its eyes now fixed directly on him. He couldn't take it any longer. He rushed forward, grabbing the doll by the waist and hurling it across the room. The porcelain figure crashed against the wall, the sound of its body hitting the wood, sickeningly loud, in the silence of the room. Evan stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the spot where the doll had landed. His heart was still racing, his pulse echoing in his head. He could feel sweat trickling down his back, his hands trembling at his sides. He had to get control of himself. He had to calm down. But then, a whisper, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. Evan's breath caught in his throat. He turned slowly, dread washing over him like ice water. There, in the middle of the floor, where he had thrown it, the doll was standing up. It wasn't lying on the ground anymore. It was standing, staring at him with those wide, unblinking eyes. Its head was slightly tilted, as if it was curious about him. It was standing upright on its own, its tiny feet perfectly balanced. The room felt colder still, the air thick with something that made Evan's skin crawl. For a long moment he couldn't move. The doll was impossibly still, but Evan knew something was wrong. Something had crossed a line, something unexplainable and terrifying. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hum of the wind outside. Then the doll's head jerked slightly, as though it was giving a small, almost imperceptible nod. Evan recoiled, as if struck. His brain couldn't process it, couldn't understand it. He staggered backward, his chest tightening with panic. Number, this wasn't happening. He looked around the room for something, anything, to give him a sense of safety. His eyes landed on the door, but that was all the encouragement he needed. Without thinking, he turned and fled, slamming the door shut behind him. Later that night, after pacing the house for what felt like hours, Evan finally allowed himself to breathe. He hadn't returned to the study after the doll had moved. He told himself it was just his mind playing tricks. Maybe the doll had fallen over, or perhaps it had just rolled when he threw it. There had to be a rational explanation, there always was. But then why couldn't he shake the feeling of being watched? Why did his own reflection in the window seem to mock him as he passed by? He sat in the living room, the lights dimmed low, trying to focus on something, anything other than the doll. His mind kept racing back to it. The way its eyes had seemed so alive, so intent on him. He had to get rid of it. But a voice in the back of his head whispered that it was too late. It was already too late. The next day, Evan tried to focus on work, anything to distract himself from the creeping unease that followed him throughout the house. The doll was still in the study, he assumed, though he hadn't dared go near it. It wasn't until late in the afternoon that the sound started. At first, it was faint, a soft rustling that barely penetrated his awareness. The sound of something shifting, moving, almost too quiet to hear. But as he walked past the study, he froze. The air had changed. It was thicker somehow, as though the room had become a separate entity, alive, watching, waiting. Evan's heart skipped a beat. He stood at the threshold of the study, the door slightly ajar. The doll was there. It had moved. It sat now on the desk, its small head turned as if it had been watching him the entire time. Its eyes, those eyes, still wide and empty, but somehow more unsettling than ever before. And then, something even worse happened. The doll moved again, not like before. This time it wasn't subtle. It jerked, its body tilting to the side, as though it were trying to stand. It was a sharp, unnatural motion, like the pull of strings, as though it were being controlled by something unseen. Evan's stomach turned. His hands grew clammy, his legs suddenly weak beneath him. And then the whispers began. They were soft at first, indistinguishable, like the sound of wind brushing through leaves, but soon they grew clearer, more distinct, until he could make out words. "Come closer." The words were sharp and deliberate, chilling in their simplicity. Evan froze in place, unable to look away from the doll. The whispering was getting louder now, almost urgent, calling him forward. A chill swept through him. This wasn't the doll. This wasn't just a toy anymore. It was alive. It wanted something. Evan's heart raced in his chest, pounding against his ribs as if trying to escape. The whispers that had started so faintly, like a breeze rustling through dry leaves, had now become louder, distinct, insistent, and unmistakably human. "Come closer." The words were soft, but their meaning was anything but. Each syllable seemed to echo in his head, reverberating through his skull like a drumbeat. The doll, the cursed thing that shouldn't have been able to move, was still. Its lifeless eyes stared at him, but now they seemed to gleam with something darker, something knowing. The whispering wasn't just in his head anymore. It felt like it was coming from the very walls of the room, wrapping around him like a fog, pulling him in. "Come closer." Evan's breath caught in his throat. His mind screamed at him to leave, to run, to slam the door and lock it behind him, but his legs refused to obey. He was rooted to the spot, as if the doll's gaze had tethered him, forcing him into its twisted web. His fingers twitched, as if they were reaching for something, some escape, some way out. They just hovered, trembling, near his side. The whispers persisted, growing louder, closer, urging him, pulling him forward with an irresistible force. "Come closer." Evan fought to resist, his instincts screaming at him to fight, to move. But as he stood there, frozen, his eyes never leaving the doll, he realized something that made his blood run cold. The doll wasn't just whispering to him, it was watching him in a way no lifeless thing could. Its eyes weren't just cold and empty anymore. No, they were alive, and they were studying him. They seemed to gleam with something darker now, something cruel, something intelligent. He didn't know how he could know that. It made no sense. But the longer he stared, the more sure he was. He swallowed, his mouth dry, his breath shallow. There was no way he could explain this, none. He had always been a practical man, the kind who scoffed at superstitions, who rolled his eyes at haunted house stories and ghostly tales, but this was different. This wasn't just his imagination playing tricks on him. He could feel it, deep in his bones. The presence that the doll had brought with it was real. It was... and it wanted something. It was a mistake. That was the only thing Evan could think as his hand reached out toward the doll. His fingers were shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he couldn't stop himself. There was something almost magnetic about the doll, an overpowering force that kept drawing him closer, made it impossible to fight. His hand hovered above the porcelain face, and just as his fingers brushed its cold, smooth surface, the room seemed to darken. The light dimmed as if the sun itself had been swallowed by the very walls of the house. A low hum filled the air, the kind that you feel in your chest more than you hear in your ears. The hum reverberated in his skull, vibrating through his teeth and making his bones ache. Then for a brief second everything stopped. The whispers ceased. The air stilled. The doll's head tilted slightly, its glassy eyes fixed on Evan with unnerving intensity. Evan stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He felt like he was suffocating, like the room was closing in on him, like he couldn't get enough air. His hand trembled uncontrollably, and his vision swam as his pulse pounded in his temples. Suddenly the doll's lips moved, not in any natural way, not like a human mouth would move, but in an unnatural, jerking motion. Its porcelain lips cracked open slightly, and the sound that came from it was not the whisper from before. No, this was different. It was a voice, a deep, echoing voice, one that rattled through the very bones of the house. "Come closer," Evan recoiled, his heart thundering in his chest, but his feet refused to move. The voice that wasn't even human, seeped into his skin, wrapping around his brain like a vice. He could feel it now, coursing through his body, pulling him in, urging him forward. His hand, no longer under his control, stretched out once more, trembling as it reached for the doll's cold face. But as his fingertips brushed against the doll, a sharp pain shot through his skull, like 1,000 needles piercing his mind. His vision blurred, and he gasped, stumbling backward into the wall. He felt as though his very mind were being ripped apart, twisted into something alien, something horrific. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pain ceased. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fuzziness in his vision, and found himself staring into the doll's eyes. Its mouth was still open, its lips parted slightly, but now there was something new, something worse, the reflection in its eyes. Evan's own face stared back at him from the doll's eyes, only it wasn't his face. No, it was twisted. His skin was pale and cracked, his eyes wide, sunken, dead, lifeless. And behind the reflection he could see the dim glow of something moving, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Suddenly the reflection smiled. Evan froze, his breath catching in his throat. The smile wasn't his. It was a jagged, grotesque grin, stretching unnaturally wide, the teeth sharp and pointed like they belonged to something inhuman. The reflection in the doll's eyes grinned at him, and Evan felt his heart lurch in his chest, his body going cold. The doll's voice came again. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was clear. It was mocking. "Closer." The word was stretched out, drawn like a sinister lullaby. Evan felt the air shift around him, felt the room closing in, the walls beginning to pulse, as if the house itself were alive. The doll was speaking to him, drawing him in, pulling him deeper into its nightmare. But this time, he couldn't move. Not because his legs were frozen or his body locked in place, but because deep down, he knew something was horribly wrong. The doll was no longer just a doll, and whatever it had reflected in its eyes wasn't just a vision. It was a warning. His feet moved before his mind could catch up. Evan didn't stop to think, didn't stop to breathe. He bolted from the room, feeling the cold hands of dread clutching at his throat. The moment he stepped out of the study, the door slammed shut behind him, the sound of it echoing through the empty house like a death knell. He rushed through the hallway, his thoughts spiraling, his heart racing in his chest. But the house felt wrong. It was as if everything had changed. The walls, the air, the very space around him. The house was no longer a place of safety, but a labyrinth. A place that twisted and bent, a living thing that was trapping him. He reached the door and yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't open. He slammed his shoulder into it again and again, but it was locked, sealed. He pounded his fist against the wood, but it was like hitting a wall. And then behind him he heard it, the soft, shuffling sound, the sound of small feet dragging across the floor, dragging themselves closer, the sound of something that should not be walking. Evan turned, his eyes wide with terror. There, at the end of the hallway, standing in the dim light, was the doll. The doll stood at the end of the hallway, its small porcelain body bathed in the dim light from the flickering lamp overhead. But it wasn't just a doll anymore. Evan could feel it, the air around him crackling with a sinister presence that he couldn't escape. The small, lifeless figure in front of him now seemed larger, darker, its porcelain skin almost alive with malice. Evan's throat tightened as he stared at the doll. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, to get out of this house. His pulse was a frantic drumbeat in his ears, and his limbs felt heavy as though they were no longer his own. The doll's eyes were wide and blinking, and its head was tilted slightly as if it were studying him with an unnatural curiosity. "Come closer." The words whispered through his skull again, but this time they weren't soft. They were clear, commanding, as if the doll was no longer just beckoning him, it was ordering him. Evan could feel the darkness in the air, thick and suffocating, pressing in on him from every direction. His body screamed for him to turn around, to run back to the safety of his bedroom or the front door. But he couldn't move. He felt rooted to the spot, as though invisible chains had wrapped themselves around his ankles and wrists. His breath came in shallow gasps, his chest tight as if a hand was squeezing the life out of him. And the whispers, they never stopped. They were inside his head now, an endless, maddening refrain. "Come closer, come closer." But he couldn't. The doll's head jerked forward, and Evan's stomach lurched. His eyes widened in horror as he saw it. The doll's mouth was stretching wider and wider, impossibly wide, its lips cracking open like porcelain splitting under pressure. A dark, oily void emerged from its throat, its tiny, toothless grin widening to something grotesque and primal. It wasn't just a doll anymore. It had become something else, something alive, something monstrous. "Come closer." Evan's mind reeled as he tried to step back, his legs shaking beneath him. His breath was a panicked gasp. He was suffocating, trapped in his own body. The air was thick, too thick to breathe. The walls of the house seemed to bend and pulse with the same ominous rhythm as his own heart. It was as if the very foundation of the place was alive, a living thing that had been infected by the doll's dark presence. And then he felt it. A cold touch, the sensation of icy fingers wrapping around his wrist, pulling him toward the doll. But it wasn't the doll's hands. No, this was something worse, something far more insidious. The touch felt wrong, like it was not human, a twisting, unnatural grip, colder than the dead of night. Evan gasped, his body jerking, but the grip only tightened, pulling him forward. The doll didn't move, but somehow it was everywhere. It was in his head, in his skin, in the very air he breathed. The very house itself seemed to be closing in, the walls narrowing, the ceiling lowering. His mind raced, his vision blurred, his body felt as though it was being pulled through thick, sticky tar. But still his feet refused to move, glued to the floor as the dark force wrapped around him. And then, as if it had been waiting for him to come closer, the doll moved. Slowly, impossibly slow, it began to shuffle toward him. Its small porcelain feet scraped against the floor with an eerie sound, like a creaking door or nails on a chalkboard. The doll's head tilted again, its eyes locked on his, its gaze penetrating, relentless. The whispers grew louder. "Come closer." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a command, a demand. The words poured into his mind, filled with such terrible urgency that Evan could no longer distinguish where they came from. They were inside him now. His stomach twisted violently. The grip on his wrist tightened, and he felt his bones creaking with the pressure. The doll was closer now, only a few feet away. It was too close. His mind screamed at him to move, to break free, but his body refused. The icy grip held him fast, and the doll's movements were like a slow dance of death. Its mouth opened again, impossibly wide, revealing nothing but an endless abyss of darkness. The cold radiating from the doll was unbearable, filling him with a sense of impending doom. He was suffocating, drowning in the dark. And then he saw it, in the doll's mouth. The darkness within its throat was not empty. Remember, there were shapes. There were things inside the black void, twisted forms, barely visible at first, but growing clearer the longer he stared. Faces of people. Their eyes were wide open, filled with terror, their mouths stretched into silent screams, their hands reaching out as if trying to escape. Evan's breath caught in his throat. His chest felt tight, like a vice had clamped around his lungs. He couldn't breathe, he couldn't scream. The faces, they were moving. The figures inside the doll's throat were shifting, contorting, their bodies twisting in unnatural ways. They looked alive. And as they moved, something inside of Evan snapped. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. The faces inside the doll weren't just trapped there. They were dead. The doll was a collector. It wasn't just a cursed object. It was an entity, feeding on the souls of those it killed, trapping them inside its porcelain shell. And now it was coming for him. The doll shuffled closer, its head tilted, its eyes gleaming with a hunger that was far beyond anything human. Its mouth opened wider, and Evan could feel the weight of those trapped souls pulling at him, their desperate hands reaching for him through the darkness. They were clawing, pulling at him with a terrible force. "No, no," Evan screamed, finally able to break free of the doll's grip. Only for a moment. The doll lunged. It moved with a speed that defied reason, its small body crossing the distance between them faster than any human could move. Evan didn't have time to react, didn't have time to run. He felt its icy fingers wrap around his throat, its grip unyielding, crushing. His breath was choked from his body and he stumbled back, his vision narrowing, everything around him blurring. His hands clawed at the doll's small arms, but it was as though he were fighting against steel. It was too late. Evan could feel the cold presence of the souls inside the doll, wrapping around his mind, pulling him into that endless void. The doll's eyes gleamed, and he saw them, the faces of those who had come before him. Their silent screams echoed in his mind as the darkness closed in. Evan's world was consumed by darkness. His breath was ragged, his lungs gasping for air that wasn't there, as the doll's fingers constricted tighter around his throat. The coldness, so unnatural, seeped into his bones. It was as though every inch of his skin was being frozen from the inside out. His vision blurred, his senses fading. He tried to scream, to fight, but the doll's grip was unyielding. His body jerked helplessly against the weight of the crushing cold that filled his chest, leaving him unable to move. All he could feel was the bone-deep terror, the relentless pull of something ancient, something evil, slowly erasing him. But even as his vision began to fade, a strange, horrific clarity came to him. He realized what was happening. The faces inside the doll, those tortured souls trapped in the abyss within the doll, were not just suffering. They had been him once. He had been one of them. Evan's hands, weak and trembling, scraped at the doll's fingers, his nails digging into its porcelain skin, but it was like fighting against stone. The doll wasn't just holding him, it was consuming him. Its cold presence was leaking into his thoughts, his memories, his very identity. He could feel the doll's hunger gnawing at him, draining him piece by piece. The darkness that had consumed him grew deeper, more suffocating. He was slipping, his body cold, numb. His vision swirled, and the world around him seemed to melt away. But then through the oppressive blackness there was a sound, faint but growing louder. A whisper, not the doll's whisper, a voice that was unmistakably human. "Evan!" The voice was so familiar, yet so distant, like a faint echo from a memory that had been buried long ago. He could barely grasp it, but he knew it. He had to. Heaven! It was his mother's voice. It was her voice calling him. Number this couldn't be real. She was long gone, passed away when he was a child. But it sounded like her, clear and real, reaching through the darkness just out of his grasp. His eyes snapped open in a panic, his breath catching in his throat, and the world around him shifted. The walls, once oppressive, now seemed to warp and distort. The doll's grip on him loosened just for a moment, enough for Evan to gasp in a breath of air that tasted like fire, like smoke. He sucked in the air, clawing at his throat, gasping as though he had been drowning. The whispering grew louder. "Evan, come back!" His mother's voice. His mother's hands were reaching for him. They were there, hovering just beyond the veil of blackness, pulling him out of the void. But just as quickly as the sensation came, it disappeared. The doll's fingers tightened around his throat again, its grip almost unbearable. The darkness closed in, and Evan's body went limp, his hands falling to his sides. The suffocating cold took over his limbs, freezing him in place. The world began to disappear again, and there was nothing left but the doll. Its cold, lifeless eyes staring down at him with a wicked satisfaction. The faces inside the doll shifted again, their eyes wide, their mouths open in wordless screams. He could feel them, their hands brushing against his soul, tugging at him, pulling him deeper into the doll's nightmare. But something inside Evan fought back. In the very depths of his terror, something primal stirred within him, an ember of defiance, of will, of a life that refused to be consumed. The doll might have taken everything else, his breath, his strength, his soul, but it couldn't take his will. Not yet. His hand, shaking violently, clawed its way back toward the doll. His fingers, numb and aching, found the doll's porcelain face, digging into its smooth surface. Could feel the cold, jagged edges of its features. The doll wasn't just a thing anymore. It was a creature, something alive, something that had taken too much of him. Something that needed to be destroyed. Evan's heart pounded in his chest, faster and faster as the doll's grip on him grew stronger. But he didn't stop. His hand tightened, pressing against the doll's face, his nails digging into the smooth porcelain, feeling the edges crack beneath his touch. The doll's mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, and the darkness inside it grew, swirling like a vortex, threatened to consume him entirely. The faces inside the doll screamed, their voices like 1,000 tortured souls, begging for release, but Evan didn't stop. The ember inside him burned brighter, hotter. With a last, desperate, wrenching scream, Evan shoved his hand deep into the doll's mouth. Everything went black. When Evan opened his eyes again, he was lying on the floor. The house was silent, unnervingly so. He could hear only the sound of his own breath, ragged and shallow. His body was covered in a cold sweat, his limbs heavy and stiff. He was still alive. He sat up slowly, his body aching as if he had been torn apart and put back together. The air was thick with the stench of old dust, the oppressive weight of the house pressing down on him. He could feel the presence of something there, something watching him. But it wasn't the same. The doll. Evan's eyes darted to the corner of the room, where it had been, where it had always been. But it was gone. The porcelain figure that had tormented him, that had almost taken his life, was no longer there. His heart thudded in his chest, a sharp pang of panic rising within him. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes searching the room desperately, but the doll was nowhere to be found. It wasn't on the shelf, it wasn't in the corner, it was just gone. But there was something else. A faint, flickering light caught his attention. In the far corner of the room, near the door, was a small, cracked mirror. He hadn't noticed it before, but now it glowed faintly as if alive. The glass was cracked, the edges jagged and sharp. He could feel something tugging at him, an unsettling, creeping sensation that sent a chill up his spine. And then he saw it. In the reflection, the doll stood in the corner. Its eyes gleamed with that same malevolent hunger. Its tiny, twisted mouth curled into a grin. But it wasn't alone. In the mirror, standing beside the doll, was a figure, Evan's own reflection, but it was different, twisted, dark, hollow-eyed. His own face stared back at him, a grotesque mockery of the man he had been. He was smiling, his mouth stretched wide in a cruel grin. And as Evan stared at the reflection, he felt the cold fingers of the doll's grip return, not on his body, but deep inside his soul. It had won. The house on Birchwood Lane was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made every creak of the floorboards sound like a shout, every gust of wind sound like a knock at the door. Emma Mitchell stood in the middle of the living room, her fingers lingering on the old wooden banister that creaked beneath her touch, a small shiver running through her spine. Her family had only moved in a week ago, but already she could tell there was something wrong with this house. The walls were thick, like they were holding on to years of forgotten secrets. The air always smelled faintly of mildew, a dampness that never quite went away, even when the windows were thrown open to the sun. The house had an old smell, stale, suffocating, as if it were trying to hold something in. Her parents, Steve and Carla, didn't seem to notice it. They were just happy to have a roof over their heads, having just moved from a cramped apartment in the city. The space was much bigger, much quieter. The town itself was sleepy and small, perhaps too small, she thought, with its rows of aging homes and streets lined with crooked streetlights. Birchwood Lane wasn't much different from 100 other streets in 100 other small towns, and the house on the corner of the block was like any other, weathered, worn down by time, with ivy creeping up the sides like fingers reaching for something it shouldn't touch. But Emma felt it. Something was off. It was the basement, mostly. That dark, mysterious place that had always been locked. Her parents insisted it was a safety measure, that there was nothing to worry about. But Emma wasn't so sure. She'd heard whispers among the neighbors, things about the old house's previous occupants. The stories weren't much to go on, just rumors, but they were enough to make her curious. She'd spent the past few days trying to find a way to sneak down there, convinced that there was something in that basement that no one wanted her to see. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just an old storage room, full of junk left behind. But Emma knew better than that. There was always something hidden in places like that. Secrets, memories, things people wanted to forget. The door to the basement had been locked since the moment they moved in. The key was nowhere to be found. Her father, always busy with unpacking and settling in, had brushed it off. "It's just an old door, probably doesn't even open," he'd said, as if that explained everything. But Emma knew better than to let it go. She wasn't the type to ignore her instincts. She never had been. It was a warm evening, the last of the golden light slipping through the drawn curtains when she found the key. It wasn't a moment of brilliance or fate, but rather an accident. Emma had been cleaning the kitchen when she dropped a spoon behind the refrigerator. The key, old and brass, rolled out from beneath the appliance, where it had obviously been for years. Her heart raced when she saw it, lying there in the dust and crumbs like a clue she wasn't meant to find. She picked it up, turning it in her hands. The shape was odd, worn down with age, but it was unmistakably the key to the basement. She knew it instinctively. The thrill of discovery shot through her like a spark. She held on to the key, the weight of it almost reassuring, a physical representation of her curiosity. But before she could act on it, she heard her mother's voice from the other room. "Emma, dinner's ready." She hesitated, the key still clutched in her palm. It would be so easy, so tempting, to turn the key and open that basement door right now. But Emma wasn't stupid. She wasn't going to risk being caught. Not yet, anyway. She slipped the key into her pocket and left the kitchen, feeling a sense of unease creeping up her spine. It wasn't the house. Not really. It was that basement, that locked door, and the strange tug she felt toward it. It was as though something was pulling her in, drawing her closer to whatever lay behind that heavy wood. That night, after dinner, after her parents had retreated to their room to watch television, Emma slipped downstairs to the hall closet, where she kept a flashlight. She held the key in one hand, the flashlight in the other. Her pulse beat in her ears as she stood in front of the basement door, the key shaking in her hand. For a moment, she almost couldn't bring herself to do it. The door was solid, ancient-looking, and its presence was heavy, like it had been waiting for her all this time. What if I'm wrong? She pushed the thought aside, willing her hand to steady. She slid the key into the lock, feeling it catch before she turned it. The door creaked, and for a split second, the noise seemed to echo all the way down the hall, as though the house itself had sighed in relief. The lock turned with an audible click, and Emma's heart leapt in her chest. The door swung open slowly, and the smell hit her first, the stale, musty odor of dust, rot, and old wood. A chill seeped through the crack, and she could almost feel the air grow colder as she stepped into the dark space. She shined the flashlight around, its beam barely cutting through the thick shadows that clung to the walls. The basement was nothing like she had expected. It wasn't a simple storage room, as she had imagined. The space stretched farther than she had anticipated, stretching deep into the ground beneath the house. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with old boxes and forgotten furniture, but there was more. There was something wrong about the room. The air felt heavy, dense, as though it were thick with something that had been buried for far too long. But the strangest thing was the sound. At first, Emma thought it was the creaking of the house, the natural shifting of wood and nails as the foundation settled. But when she listened more closely, she realized it wasn't the house making the noise. It was something else. Something alive. "Emma." She froze. The voice was faint, barely audible, like a whisper lost in the wind, but it came from somewhere deep within the basement, somewhere below the floorboards. Her heart skipped a beat as she strained to hear. "Emma!" The voice was clearer this time, louder, but it wasn't just a voice, it was her voice. Emma blinked in confusion, her breath coming faster. There was no way it was her. She was the only one down there. Her flashlight quivered in her hand as she scanned the room again, the beam flicking over the shadowed corners of the basement. "Who's there?" she called, her voice thin and shaky. But the response came immediately. "Who's there?" The voice mimicked her. It repeated her words back to her, word for word. It was exactly the same, her own voice, but not her. Emma's throat went dry. She took a hesitant step forward, her shoes making soft noises against the concrete floor. The beam of the flashlight bounced erratically in her hand as she shined it toward the far end of the room, where the darkness seemed to thicken, swallowing the light. The voice was closer now. "Come here." Emma's breath caught in her throat. It was her voice again, but it was different, slightly distorted, colder, like it had been dipped in shadow. A shiver ran down her spine. Her heart pounded against her chest. The voice wasn't hers. It couldn't be. "Who are you?" she asked again, but her voice wavered, unsure now. There was a long pause, and then it came again. "Who are you?" The voice was mimicking her again perfectly, but this time the words were sharper, more menacing. It was as if whatever was down there was learning from her. Her pulse quickened. A chill raced through her veins. The basement had become something else, a place not just of forgotten things, but of something hiding in the dark. The voice began to laugh, soft at first, but growing louder, until it was a deep, mocking sound that filled the basement with a terrible weight. "Come here," it said again, its voice drawing closer to hers, as though it were mimicking her every move. Emma's eyes darted around the basement in panic. It was growing darker, colder. The shadows were creeping in, drawing her toward the voice. But she didn't know what she was running toward, or what she was about to face. Emma's heart hammered in her chest as the voice echoed back at her. "Come here." The words hung in the air like a dark omen, taunting her, beckoning her toward something she couldn't yet understand. The flashlight's beam flickered nervously as if it too was afraid of what lay beyond its reach. Her breath was shallow, quick, her pulse racing with the familiar, sickening feeling of being watched. Every hair on her body stood on end, and despite the warmth of the summer evening still lingering outside, a chill seeped through the walls, through her skin, wrapping around her bones. It wasn't just the voice that made her shiver, it was the way it sounded. Wrong. It was hers, but not hers. It was as though something else, something ancient and dark, had slipped inside her voice and twisted it, drained it of humanity. "Who are you?" Emma croaked, her throat dry, her legs like lead beneath her. The voice answered immediately, a perfect mimic of her own. "Who are you?" Emma froze, the words cutting through her like a knife. She didn't know why, but the way it spoke, how it repeated her words over and over, felt wrong in a way that went deeper than fear. It wasn't just the sound of her voice that sent a shiver crawling up her spine. It was the knowing. Whoever or whatever was down there knew her. It had heard her, understood her, knew what she would say before she said it. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to shake off the irrational panic threatening to grip her. "Get it together, Emma," but the more she tried to steady herself, the more the air around her seemed to pulse with a malignant presence. The shadows in the basement stretched longer, reaching out like fingers, and the temperature dropped rapidly. The voice whispered again, this time much softer, like a breath against her ear. "Come here, Emma." She shuddered violently, a gut-wrenching wave of dread washing over her. It was no longer just mimicking her, it was calling her. But why? With a shaky hand, she reached for the flashlight again, feeling its weight in her grip, almost as if the flashlight itself had become a talisman against the darkness. She flicked the beam around the room once more, but the shadows didn't dissipate. They only seemed to gather, closing in tighter around her. And as she did, she caught sight of something moving, something inside the shadows, something that shouldn't have been there. A figure, a silhouette, just on the edge of her sight, standing still. It was tall, unnaturally so, its form indistinct, shrouded by the thick dark. And the longer she stared at it, the clearer it became. It was her, not just a reflection, but an exact replica of Emma, standing at the far side of the basement, facing her. Her heart skipped a beat as she staggered backward, the flashlight beam trembling in her hand. No, she thought, her mind whirling in panic. This can't be real, it's just a trick of the light. A shadow, nothing more. But the figure didn't disappear. It stood there, unmoving, watching her. "Come here, Emma," the voice said again. But this time, it wasn't just a mimic. There was an edge to it, a deeper layer of darkness that sent a wave of nausea crawling up her throat. It wasn't her voice anymore. It was something else, something darker, something alive. Her knees nearly buckled beneath her. The terror was suffocating, choking off her breath. She had to get out, she had to leave, but she couldn't look away from the figure, from the way it moved, slowly, deliberately, as though it was mimicking her every action, step by step, until it inched closer. Her breath hitched in her throat. Emma spun around, her hand fumbling for the doorknob, but as her fingers brushed against the cold metal, she realized something terrible. The door, the one she had just opened only moments ago, was now locked. It had locked itself. Her pulse raced as she banged her fist against the door, desperation flooding her mind. She rattled the knob, pulling at the handle with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. "Let me out!" she screamed. "Please!" But the voice only responded with an echo of her own. "Please, let me out!" Emma's stomach churned, the feeling of being trapped intensifying. Her eyes darted back to the figure, still standing motionless in the corner of the basement. It wasn't just her reflection anymore. The figure had started to move in small, jerky steps, mimicking every twitch of her body. She could hear the sound of its feet dragging across the floor, each step punctuated by a soft scrape against the concrete. It was getting closer. Every step it took seemed to draw the shadows around her tighter. They weren't just shadows anymore. They had a weight to them, a presence, pressing in from all sides. She felt as though the walls were closing in, the floor beneath her feet tilting, as if the entire basement were alive, shifting, pulsing with hunger. Emma. Her name was a cold, hollow whisper that brushed against her ear from behind. But when she whirled around, there was nothing there. Just the sound of the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. Her breath was shallow, her hands trembling. She had to think, she had to get out, she had to... No! Something stopped her, a sharp, gnawing sensation deep in her gut. It wasn't just fear, it was familiarity. This thing, whatever it was echoing her, mimicking her. Her every movement, her every breath, it was learning her, the way it stood, the way it spoke, the way it copied her. The realization hit her like a freight train. The figure wasn't just imitating her, it was becoming her. "Stop," Emma gasped, backing away further into the darkness. But the figure didn't stop. Its twisted grin, the one that had never been hers but was still familiar, curled wider. Its body moved like a shadow, fluid and unnatural. It was growing closer. Her pulse was deafening in her ears as she backed herself into a corner of the room. Her mind raced, her thoughts jumbled. There was something wrong with the air, something wrong with the space itself. The walls were pressing in, the shadows were tightening around her, pulling at her skin, pulling at her very soul. And then, just as the figure was mere inches from her, its face twisted into something grotesque. A mockery of her own features, distorted and stretched. "Emma!" the voice whispered once more, but this time it was different. It wasn't just her voice. It was an amalgamation of voices, layered, overlapping, each one contorted in agony. It was an unnatural chorus of the damned. Emma closed her eyes, unable to take it any longer. But the voice didn't stop. It was everywhere now, wrapping around her, filling her head with its suffocating presence. "Emma, come here." And just like that, it wasn't her voice anymore. It was something else entirely. Emma's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. The shadows seemed to pulse, a living thing, tightening around her in a suffocating grip. The mimicry of her voice, of her movements, was no longer just a disturbing echo. It was becoming an all-consuming presence. Every second that passed in the basement felt like a century, each moment stretching longer and longer as the shadows seemed to close in on her from all sides. She couldn't think straight anymore. Her mind was a blur of fear, confusion, and desperate panic. "Emma!" The voice, her voice, whispered again, this time with a chilling softness, but it wasn't just speaking to her anymore, it was her. Emma backed up against the cold concrete wall, feeling its unforgiving hardness press into her back. Her breath was ragged now, her hands trembling as she clutched the flashlight. Figure, the twisted reflection of herself, moved closer, its body contorting unnaturally. Its footsteps were slow, deliberate. Every motion felt as though it was learning from her, feeding off her fear. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the nightmare unfolding before her. Her hands fumbled desperately for the doorknob once again, but it was no use. The door, which she had unlocked just moments before, had turned against her, now sealed tight, as though the house itself had become part of the trap. A dark, suffocating silence hung in the air. She could feel her pulse, thudding in her ears, louder than her thoughts, louder than the voice that whispered her name. "Stop!" she cried, her voice barely more than a breath. "I won't!" But before she could finish, the figure reached out with unnaturally long arms, the shadows folding and shifting around it like tendrils of smoke. It was so close now, so close that she could feel the cold, wet air that clung to it. The smile on its face wasn't her own anymore. It was something else, something worse. It was twisted, elongated, a grotesque parody of her features. But its eyes, those were still her own, still the same. "Come here, Emma." The voice purred again, and this time it was laced with a terrible, mocking sweetness. "I'm you. You're me. We're the same." The words scraped against her skin like shards of glass. The basement, once a simple storage space, had become a prison, a suffocating tomb where the walls seemed to lean in closer and closer, squeezing the air from her lungs. She couldn't breathe. The shadows were suffocating her. "Stop it!" Emma shrieked, her voice cracking with fear, her hands shaking violently as she tried to push herself away from the wall, tried to run, but her legs didn't respond. Her body, so full of adrenaline, was paralyzed, frozen in place. The figure's smile widened, its mouth stretching in an unnatural, horrifying grin. It stepped forward, the shadows that surrounded it thickening like a black fog. And then, without warning, the air in the room seemed to shift. Everything seemed to slow down. The sound of Emma's heartbeat, the whir of the flashlight's beam, the very weight of the air itself seemed to distort. Time was no longer moving normally. It felt as though she had slipped out of reality, out of the world she knew, into something darker, more distorted. The basement was no longer just a room in her house. It had become a space where time bled into itself, where reality twisted and contorted like a funhouse mirror. The figure leaned in, so close now that Emma could feel its cold breath against her face. And then, just as it opened its mouth to speak, she heard something else. Something faint, muffled at first, but growing clearer. A voice. Her voice. "Emma, it's time to go." It wasn't the echoing mimic. It wasn't the malevolent thing in front of her. It was her. For a fleeting moment, the real Emma could hear herself, calling out from the darkness, trying to break free of the terror, trying to make her presence known. But it was fading, that other Emma's voice. The real Emma felt herself being pulled, dragged back into the depths of the twisted version of herself that loomed before her. The shadows around her seemed to dissolve into the space, creeping under her skin, digging into her. And then Then the world went still. In the complete silence that followed, Emma heard the voice again, only this time it wasn't the eerie, mocking tone she'd heard before. This time the voice was clear. It was her own. The figure was gone. Emma blinked, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. The flashlight's beam quivered weakly in her hand as she glanced around the room. The figure, the thing that had mimicked her, was gone. But she wasn't alone. The voice called again, but it was no longer the mocking mimic of herself. Now it was her own voice, her own true voice, though it sounded distant, as if it were coming from another time, another place.
Emma! The voice wasn't just a whisper now. It was a cry that echoed through the basement like a scream trapped within the walls. Emma's heart skipped a beat. That voice, it wasn't just an echo. It was someone, or something, else trapped in this basement with her. And whatever it wasn't done with her. The cold in the room seemed to deepen, swirling around her like a thick fog seeping into her bones. Her breath came faster now, shallow and ragged, as her eyes darted back to the door. The locked door. The one that had not been locked before. She slammed her hand against it again, pushing with all her strength, but the door didn't move. It didn't budge. "Let me out!" she screamed, her voice trembling with terror. "Please, I just want to go!" The answer came immediately. Only it wasn't a voice this time. It was a sound, scratching from beneath the floor, beneath the walls like nails dragging across the earth. Something was moving down there, something alive. The scratching grew louder, closer, and Emma, trapped in the nightmare of the basement, felt her body quiver, her mind splitting in two as the terrible truth began to sink in. It had never been about the door. The house wasn't just keeping her in, it was keeping something else out. Or worse, keeping something in. She stumbled backward, her flashlight shaking violently in her grip. She turned toward the far corner of the basement, the shadows swallowing the light. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't from below, it wasn't from behind the walls, it was coming from her own body. Emma gasped, her mouth dry, as the sound of scratching, clawing, scraping mimicked her very movements. Something was crawling inside her, something that wanted out, something that was learning her, taking her, becoming her. And as she felt her mind begin to unravel, she realized the voice in the basement wasn't just a trap, it was her. And she was the one who was never supposed to leave. The scratching was relentless. It gnawed at Emma's sanity with every passing second, a maddening, sharp sound that scraped at her nerves. Her body trembled involuntarily, her hands frozen on the flashlight, as if she could will the light to silence the noise. The sound wasn't just a noise, it was an invasion. Something was inside her, crawling beneath her skin, gnawing at her from within. And it wasn't just her. The scratching was outside too, pressing from the walls, from the floorboards, as if the very house itself was alive, feeding off her fear. Her head throbbed. Her thoughts were slipping, swimming in the dark waters of dread. She couldn't think, she couldn't focus. It was as if her mind was being pulled apart, piece by piece, like thread unraveling from a spool. "It's just the fear," she told herself, trying to steady her breath. "Just the fear making it worse. You're imagining things. This is all in your head." But it wasn't in her head. The scratching stopped suddenly, and Emma gasped, her throat tight, expecting the worst. She stood absolutely still, holding her breath, listening. The silence that followed was so thick she could feel it pressing against her skin, coating her in cold sweat. Her hand tightened around the flashlight as she scanned the basement, eyes darting frantically, searching for any sign of movement. And then a whisper. Emma. It was low, barely audible, but it came from directly behind her. Her stomach churned with a primal, deep terror. She didn't want to turn around. She didn't want to face whatever was there, but she knew she had no choice. Slowly, her head swiveled to the side, her heart hammering in her chest as she looked toward the stairs leading up to the rest of the house. Nothing. The basement remained the same, its oppressive darkness stretching farther than the beam of her flashlight could reach. But the whisper had been so close, too close. It was in her ear, right behind her. A sickening thought crept into her mind. She spun around, searching desperately, but the basement was empty, save for the shadows that had taken on a new life of their own. The walls seemed to pulse and shift, and the air was thick with an unseen presence. Something old, something powerful. "Stop," she whispered to herself, trying to convince her racing heart to slow. "It's all in your head. You need to stay calm." But even as the words left her mouth, she knew, deep down, it wasn't just fear anymore. Something was in this basement with her. And it wasn't something that could be explained away. The scratching began again, this time louder, more urgent. It came from beneath the floor, echoing through the space, filling her ears. Emma turned sharply, her flashlight shaking in her hand as she looked at the ground. The wood beneath her feet trembled as though something was trying to break through. And then the scraping stopped. For a fleeting moment, the basement was still. And in that stillness, Emma felt it. Something different. A cold presence, a pressure on the air. It wasn't the shadows. It wasn't the voice. It was something more intimate, something that had been with her all along. She didn't know how she knew it, but Emma knew. Whatever was in the basement, whatever had been mimicking her, it was inside her now. Her body trembled uncontrollably, and she dropped to her knees, the flashlight slipping from her hand, the beam pointing at the floor, casting long, twisted shadows across the room. Her chest heaved with shallow breaths, and her fingers dug into the cold, unforgiving concrete. Her mind was fractured, splintering apart, piece by piece, like glass being crushed underfoot. "Please," she whispered, her voice thin and desperate. "Please let me out." She clawed at the door again, but it remained unyielding. The locked door, the one she could have sworn had opened just moments ago, had become a barrier between her and whatever was lurking beyond. The truth was becoming clearer with every passing second. This wasn't just a house. This wasn't just a basement. This was something older, something that had been waiting for her, drawing her in with every step she took. It had been waiting for her to open the door, waiting for her to listen. "Emma," the voice again. Closer now, louder. She turned, her body frozen in fear, and saw it, the figure. It was standing there in the corner of the basement, in the shadows, a twisted mirror image of herself. The creature, the thing that had been mimicking her voice, her movements, her every breath, was no longer a vague presence. It was now fully formed, its form solidifying in the darkness like a nightmare given flesh. Its eyes, her eyes, stared at her, a grin twisted across its face. It had become her, every inch of her, and in doing so, it had become something far worse. "You're not me," Emma gasped, her voice breaking. "You're not me." But the figure only smiled, that horrific, unholy grin stretching wider with every second. "We are the same," it said, its voice cold and mocking, an exact replica of hers. "We are one." Emma's breath hitched as the air grew colder. She could feel it now, the pull of the figure. It was drawing her in,
forcing her to confront her own reflection. The entity wasn't just mimicking her, it was taking her, piece by piece, bit by bit, until there would be nothing left. "No!" she screamed, but the words felt hollow in her throat. Her voice was drowned out by the growing hum in the air, the sound of something dark and powerful, something ancient, coursing through the basement, through the very walls of the house. "You are me," the figure whispered again, "and I am you." Her body moved of its own accord. Her hands, shaking, rose to her face, but it wasn't her hands anymore. They felt strange, foreign, like they didn't belong to her. Her fingers stretched unnaturally, curling toward her own reflection in the air, reaching for the twisted version of herself that stood across the room. Emma tried to fight it. She tried to scream, to break free, but she couldn't. Her body betrayed her, her muscles locking in place, her mind locked in a prison of its own making. The presence in the room, the thing that was inside her, was taking over. And then, she understood. She wasn't just trapped in the basement. She was trapped inside herself. The door had never been the escape. The walls had never been the problem. The real horror wasn't what was in the house. It was what had always been inside her, waiting to be freed. The figure, that grotesque mirror image of her, stepped forward, its hands reaching for Emma, as though it were pulling her into the abyss with it. And for the first time, Emma realized the truth. There was no way out. The figure's fingers stretched toward her, slow and deliberate, a twisted mockery of her own hand. Its smile grew wider, the grotesque version of her reflection so far removed from anything human. Emma's breath hitched in her chest, her heart hammering like a wild drum as the thing in front of her moved closer, closer, until she could feel its cold breath against her skin. The warmth she had once felt in her own body was gone, replaced by a numbing chill that seemed to radiate from the darkness itself. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The fear, the terror, had choked her throat into silence. She was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to fight back against the thing that was slowly, surely consuming her. "You're mine now," the figure whispered, its voice sweet and sickeningly familiar. It was her voice, but distorted, touched by something far darker than she could have ever imagined. The darkness in the room seemed to swell, surrounding her, pressing in on her like a suffocating fog. The shadows clung to her skin, crawling beneath her clothes, as though they wanted to tear her apart from the inside out. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to run, but she couldn't move. She was trapped, imprisoned, not by the walls of the basement, but by the thing that had been planted deep inside her mind. The figure raised its hand, and Emma's body jerked involuntarily. She felt her muscles stiffen, her limbs responding to an unseen force, her head tilted back as the creature moved its fingers slowly, deliberately, guiding her own hands to her face. It was like she wasn't in control anymore, like she was watching herself from the outside as the thing that was her pulled her body toward it. "You're me," it repeated, its voice full of triumph. "You've always been me. We've always been the same." A flash of memories surged through her mind, a moment from the past, before the basement, before all of this horror. She remembered the day she first found the house, how it had seemed perfect. The grand old home with its wooden floors, its creaky, mysterious charm. She had been drawn to it instantly, almost as if the house itself had been calling to her. The basement had seemed like an innocent curiosity, something dark and hidden, something that belonged in a forgotten corner of the world. But the house had known. The house had always known. It was then, in that fragile moment of clarity, that Emma realized the truth. The reflection in front of her wasn't just mimicking her. It had always been there, lying in wait. The whispers, the scratching, the locked door. It wasn't just the house trying to trap her. It had been drawing her in, beckoning her to uncover the basement's dark secret. The entity that stood before her, claiming to be her, was no stranger. It had always been inside her, waiting to break free. "You don't belong here," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. She was unsure whether she was speaking to the figure or to herself. "I won't let you take me." But the figure only laughed, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the basement, bouncing off the walls and twisting in the corners of her mind. "It's too late," it hissed. "You've always belonged here. You're mine, and you always will be." The air thickened around her, becoming impossibly heavy, suffocating her with the weight of the realization. The room was closing in. The shadows, once separate from the walls, now bled into them, like ink spreading across paper, until the basement was nothing more than a void, a pit where reality and illusion blurred together. The house was no longer a home, it was a prison, and Emma was its prisoner. Suddenly everything went still. The figure froze, its hand still outstretched toward her, and for a brief moment Emma felt a strange calm wash over her. The oppressive weight of the shadows lifted slightly and her thoughts cleared. In that moment of clarity, she understood what she had to do. She had to confront herself. With all the strength she could muster, Emma took a deep breath. Her chest felt tight, her heart beating faster with every second, but she refused to let the fear control her. She reached up and grabbed the cold, trembling fingers of the figure, her reflection. "You're not me," Emma whispered again, this time with more conviction. "You're just a part of me, but you don't control me." The figure's eyes flickered with something: rage, fear, desperation. It recoiled for a fraction of a second, as if Emma's words had struck at the core of the darkness that had taken hold of her. The smile faltered, twisting into something else, a grimace, a snarl. "You're wrong," the figure spat. "You are me. We're the same." But Emma shook her head. "Number, you are my fear, my darkness. You've never been real. I can leave you behind." In a final surge of willpower, she pushed the figure back. The shadows, the oppressive weight, and the darkness that had surrounded her began to dissipate, fading into the nothingness from which they had come. The basement, once a claustrophobic nightmare, seemed to crack and crumble under the weight of her defiance. The house groaned, the walls creaking and shifting as though they were alive. The locked door behind her groaned, the latch giving way. Slowly, slowly, the door opened, revealing the faintest glimmer of light. With one last glance at the dark reflection of herself, Emma turned and stumbled toward the door. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She was free. As she emerged from the basement, she felt the weight of the house lift from her shoulders. The oppressive shadows that had once filled the basement no longer clung to her, no longer threatened to swallow her whole. But even as the door shut behind her, Emma knew, deep in her gut, that the echoes of the basement would follow her. The house had claimed part of her. The thing in the basement had taken a piece of her soul. And while she had escaped its grasp, it would never truly let her go. The reflection would always be there, watching from the shadows, waiting. David had always been a fan of the strange, the unique, the things that lived on the fringes of normalcy. So when he stumbled into the old thrift store on a rainy Thursday afternoon, something inside him clicked. The moment his eyes landed on the painting, the world outside seemed to fade into a soft blur. The storm that battered the windows, the cluttered aisles, and the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights, they all disappeared in an instant. It was a landscape painting, almost too beautiful for words. The vibrant colors, Sunset orange, deep purples, and cool greens captured a serene moment in time. A valley stretched out, bathed in the soft glow of twilight, with mountains looming in the distance, their peaks dusted with snow. A small, winding river cut through the valley floor, shimmering beneath the fading light. And yet, despite its beauty, something about the painting felt off. At first it was subtle, a soft tug at the edges of his consciousness, like something familiar yet completely out of place. His eyes were drawn to the background of the painting, where a shadow stood on the edge of the riverbank, partially obscured by a clump of trees. The figure was dark and vague, barely discernible. It could have been anyone, just another part of the landscape. But it wasn't the figure that caught David's attention. It was the feeling of movement. David blinked, squinting at the canvas. The figure hadn't moved. Of course it hadn't. It was just a painting after all. But there it was, again, a flicker at the edge of his vision. For a second, the figure had seemed different, more distinct. And the shadows in the painting, they seemed a little darker, more foreboding than they had been just moments before. He felt a chill run down his spine, and for the first time in a long while, David felt the kind of unease that had once plagued him as a child. Something wasn't right, but he couldn't look away. He stepped closer, as though the painting had a magnetic pull on him, drawing him in against his better judgment. "Nice, isn't it?" The voice of the shopkeeper broke through his thoughts, sudden and jarring. David jumped slightly, turning to face the old woman, who had appeared beside him without warning. She had a wiry frame and a crooked smile that made her seem less like a person and more like a relic from another time. "It's beautiful," David murmured, still eyeing the painting. The figure in the background was clearer now. A man, a woman, hard to tell. The shadows around it seemed to grow more pronounced, darker, more real. The shopkeeper's smile widened. "That painting's been here for a while," she said, her voice raspy. "Not many people take an interest in it, but you've got an eye for the strange, don't you?" David felt a strange tug in his chest. "What do you mean?" She leaned in closer, her breath cold on his ear. "I think it's been waiting for someone like you." David frowned, perplexed. "What do you mean, waiting?" The shopkeeper chuckled, a dry, brittle sound. "Oh, never mind, it's just an old painting, but I'd keep an eye on it if I were you. You never know what might happen when things like that start to move." She straightened up and gave him an almost too wide smile before walking away, leaving David standing alone with the painting, the ominous figure still lingering in the background of the canvas. He shook his head, dismissing the woman's words as nonsense. It was just a painting, nothing more. But the uneasy feeling remained, gnawing at the back of his mind like a persistent itch that he couldn't scratch. He glanced back at the painting and felt a wave of vertigo. The figure was closer now, or so it seemed. The shadows around it had deepened, making it appear more solid, more defined. The eyes, if they were eyes, were staring straight at him. But it was impossible. The painting couldn't change. It was just a painting. Yet, despite his best efforts to convince himself otherwise, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Without thinking, he reached for his wallet and paid the shopkeeper. She handed him the painting, her smile still lingering in her eyes, and as he walked out of the store, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of excitement. Something told him that this painting was not just a piece of art, it was a sign. That night, after dinner, David hung the painting on the wall of his living room. The soft light from the lamp above cast a warm glow over the landscape, the sunset's colors shifting as the room settled into evening. The figure, now framed by the canvas, stood in the distance. It seemed to hold its place in the painting, locked in time. Still, for the first hour, everything seemed normal. The flickering of the streetlights outside, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint rustle of the trees in the wind. But something about the air had changed. The atmosphere in the room felt heavier, as though the painting were breathing, sighing with the rhythm of the house. It was subtle at first, but David began to notice an odd stillness creeping into the room, a hush that settled around the edges of his mind. As the clock ticked past midnight, he stood up from his chair, stretching his legs. His eyes were drawn again to the painting, the figure in the distance. He swore he saw it move, just for a moment. But it was impossible. He blinked, took a step closer, and squinted. The figure was exactly where it had been before. Still, yet something felt different. He couldn't explain it, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The figure, whatever it was, seemed to be waiting, watching. And David felt as though, for the first time since bringing it home, the painting wasn't just hanging on his wall. It was alive. David shook his head, frustrated. He needed to get some sleep. He would deal with the strange feeling tomorrow. But as he turned away, something caught his eye. The figure in the painting had moved again, and this time it wasn't just a flicker. It was as if it had stepped out of the shadows closer to the riverbank, and its outline was clearer now, almost too clear. David's heart stopped in his chest. The figure wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had eyes, and it was staring right at him. David froze. The room seemed to narrow in around him, his breath catching in his throat as he stared at the painting. The figure, its features once blurred and indistinct, was now undeniably clear. It wasn't a trick of the light, nor a product of his imagination. The figure's eyes were fixed upon him, dark and unblinking like two hollow pools of ink staring through the canvas. A cold wave of dread washed over him, tightening his chest, but he couldn't look away. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to move, to step back, but something in the pit of his stomach kept him rooted in place. It was as if the figure's gaze had wrapped itself around his spine, holding him in place. Slowly, hesitantly, David took a step forward, his heart thudding in his chest. The closer he got, the more distinct the figure became. It was no longer just a silhouette standing in the background, but a man, tall, gaunt, with an almost unnatural stillness to him. His clothes were old-fashioned, faded, as if the figure itself belonged to a different time, a time that had long since passed. David swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe, but the air seemed thick, suffocating. His mind screamed at him to move away from the painting, to get out of the room, but his feet wouldn't obey. The figure's eyes were no longer just staring. They were following him. No matter where he moved, no matter how much distance he tried to put between himself and the painting, the eyes remained fixed upon him, cold and unyielding. He turned away sharply, heart hammering in his chest, and stumbled back toward his chair. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating, heavy with something dark, something ancient. His mind raced as he tried to rationalize what he had seen. There had to be a logical explanation. The painting was just an illusion, right? Trick of light, a figment of his tired mind playing tricks on him. But even as he tried to convince himself, the unease lingered, gnawing at him like 1,000 tiny needles pressing against his skin. He tried to focus on something else, anything else, but all he could think of was the way the figure's eyes had locked onto his, unblinking, unrelenting. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, the noise startling in the otherwise silent room. He needed air. A walk, something to clear his head, anything to shake off the overwhelming feeling that something was horribly, terribly wrong. David grabbed his coat from the back of the chair, his eyes once again drawn to the painting. He quickly averted his gaze, forcing himself to look away. He didn't dare look back at it as he opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air. The walk didn't help. The streets outside were quiet, the usual sounds of the city muted by the late hour. David found himself walking aimlessly, his mind racing. What was happening? Was it possible that the painting really had moved? He shook his head, muttering under his breath. He had to be losing it. It was just an old painting, nothing more. His mind was playing tricks on him. But even as he walked, the image of the figure's eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, stayed with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching him, even though he was miles away from the painting. By the time he returned home, the unease had only grown. His apartment felt different, more oppressive than it had been earlier that evening. The air seemed thick with a sense of something he couldn't explain. When he opened the door, he froze. The painting, his painting, was no longer hanging where he had left it. Instead, it was leaning against the wall just inside the door. The canvas was tilted slightly, and there, in the middle of the picture, stood the figure again. This time, he was closer to the foreground, standing right by the riverbank, his form even more solid than before. He was dressed in the same old-fashioned clothes, his face still pale and gaunt. But now there was something darker about the figure, something far more sinister in the way it was positioned. David's stomach twisted and a cold chill shot up his spine. He had not moved the painting. He hadn't touched it at all. But it had moved. His gaze locked onto the figure once more, and for a split second he thought he saw the faintest movement, a ripple in the air, a shimmer as if the painting itself was alive. His breath quickened as he took a step forward, his heart thudding in his chest. And that was when he saw it. The figure's lips, thin, cracked, and almost imperceptible, seemed to shift. Not much, but just enough for David to see. It wasn't smiling, it wasn't even a neutral expression. It was something much more malevolent, a grim, thin-lipped sneer that sent a wave of nausea through him. Before he could move, the figure's eyes locked onto his again. This time, they were no longer just watching. They were demanding something. A dark, insatiable hunger radiated from them, a desire that was almost physical. David's knees buckled and he grabbed the edge of the table to steady himself. His mind screamed at him to leave, to get out of the room, but he couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, frozen by the intense gaze of the figure. The shadows around the painting seemed to ripple, darkening further. The room felt colder, the air heavier. And then, in the eerie silence of the room, something unexpected happened. The figure in the painting moved again. This time, it wasn't just a shift. The figure began to step toward him, slowly, deliberately. Each movement was precise, calculated, like it had been waiting for this moment, for David to finally notice. The landscape, once peaceful and serene, now seemed to warp and shift around the figure, bending and twisting unnaturally. The riverbank that had once been quiet and still now seemed to pulse with a strange energy, like the water itself was alive with a hunger that matched the figure's. David's pulse quickened as he took a step back, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. The figure was moving closer to him, its feet now stepping out from the frame, its body sliding inch by inch out of the painting. The shadows seemed to stretch out, reaching for him, curling around his legs like invisible hands. Before he could react, the figure was out. The moment it crossed the frame, the temperature in the room dropped, the air thickening with an unnatural cold. David's breath came out in a sharp, foggy gasp. He stumbled backward, his legs shaking. The figure stood in front of him now, its eyes still fixed upon him, its body solid and real, its presence overwhelming. The painting, now just a canvas, lay crumpled on the floor behind it. And for the first time, David realized that the nightmare had only just begun. David's heartbeat thundered in his ears as the figure stood before him, its eyes never leaving his face. The coldness in the room deepened, a biting chill that seemed to cut through him, sinking into his bones. The figure's clothes, dark and faded, seemed to rustle slightly, despite the stillness of the air. The river, once a calm presence in the painting, seemed to ripple as though disturbed by some unseen force, as though it had become real too. David could almost hear the faint sound of rushing water in the background. He wanted to scream, he wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. His mind raced, screaming at him to flee, but his body was frozen in place, locked in a trance by the figure's gaze. It was real. This wasn't a nightmare. This wasn't some hallucination or trick of the light. The figure, this thing, was standing in front of him, in his living room, as real as anything else in the room. And the painting, the thing that had drawn him in from the beginning, lay discarded on the floor, its canvas empty now, as if it had given up its last secret. David opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His throat felt tight, like a vice had clamped around it. Every instinct told him to look away, to turn and run, but it was as though his body didn't belong to him anymore. His eyes remained locked on the figure, drawn in like a moth to a flame. The figure's lips parted slightly. No words came, but David could feel something far more sinister, bubbling beneath the surface of the silence. There was an energy radiating from it, like a storm on the horizon, promising destruction, but holding its power in check, waiting for something. David didn't know how much time passed. Seconds? Minutes? It felt like hours, like he was drowning in the figure's stare, unable to breathe, unable to think. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure moved. It took one slow, deliberate step toward him, and the air thickened with an almost tangible weight, the pressure in the room rising like a balloon ready to pop. David's chest constricted as he gasped for air. His heart felt like it was going to explode. The figure was too close now, standing barely a few feet away. Its face, once distant and shadowed in the painting, was now unmistakably clear. The gaunt features, the pale skin, the hollow, sunken eyes that were so dark they seemed to swallow light. The lips, thin and cracked, curled upward into a grotesque, twisted smile. David's knees buckled and he staggered back, unable to stop himself. His mind was a frenzy of panic, but all he could do was stare at the thing that had emerged from the painting, from the nightmare he had brought into his home. The figure took another step forward. David's back hit the wall and the cold seeped through the plaster, through his clothes, into his skin. The chill wrapped around him like a suffocating fog. He was trapped. He had nowhere to go. And then the figure spoke. Its voice was low, a rasping whisper that scraped against his eardrums. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, like a distant echo, carried on a breeze that had no source. You shouldn't have looked. David's blood ran cold, a wave of terror washing over him, as though the words had taken on a physical weight. He had heard that voice before. He had heard it in the painting, in the murmur of the shadows, but now it was real. It was here. You shouldn't have brought me here. David couldn't speak. He couldn't even move. His mind was screaming for him to do something, to break free from the hold the figure had on him, but all he could do was stare. His hands shook violently, his breathing shallow and erratic. The figure tilted its head slightly as though studying him, as though it could sense his terror. And then it did something that made David's stomach twist violently. It smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile, not even a grin. It was a grotesque, mocking thing, stretched too wide, the corners of the mouth curving upward unnaturally, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. The figure's teeth weren't human. They were jagged, uneven, like they belonged to something far older, far darker. The pressure in the room grew heavier, suffocating. David gasped for air, but it felt like there was none left to breathe. The figure's smile stretched even wider, as though it was savoring his fear. It was feeding off it, drawing strength from his terror, growing stronger with each passing moment. "You can't leave now," the figure rasped, its voice growing louder, more distorted. "You called me here, and now—" Before David could react, the figure reached out, its hand moving so fast, so suddenly, that he didn't have time to step back. The fingers were long and unnaturally thin, the nails blackened and cracked. The hand touched his chest, and a wave of ice shot through him, freezing him from the inside out. "Now, you belong to me." David's body jolted as though struck by an invisible force. The world around him seemed to distort, bending and warping like the paint on the canvas itself. His vision blurred, and for a moment he felt as though he were floating in some vast, empty void, the air thick with something wrong, something ancient, something hungry. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the pressure vanished. The figure was gone. David blinked, his heart racing, his chest heaved, as though he had been holding his breath for a lifetime. The room was cold, but the figure was no longer in front of him. The silence felt deafening, and for a moment he thought he might pass out. But he didn't. His hands shook uncontrollably as he stumbled backward, his eyes darting around the room. The painting, the cursed thing that had brought this nightmare into his life, was still on the floor where it had fallen, its canvas lifeless, empty. But the figure, the thing was gone, or was it? David's mind raced. He didn't know what had just happened, but he felt it. That oppressive weight still hung in the air, like something malevolent was lurking just out of sight, waiting. And then he heard it, a whisper, low and guttural, like a snake slithering through the air. It came from nowhere, but it was unmistakable. "You can't escape me." David's blood ran cold, his eyes widening in terror. The voice was unmistakable. The figure had left him, yes, but it was still there, watching, waiting. He wasn't alone anymore. David's blood ran cold as the whisper echoed in the room. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, each beat a reminder that he wasn't alone, that whatever had come from the painting was still here, lurking in the shadows. He spun around, his eyes scanning the corners of the room, but there was nothing. Nothing but the still, oppressive silence that hung in the air. But he knew. He felt it. It was still there. Whatever had crossed over from the painting was near. The darkness in the room seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a heavy presence that seemed to wrap around him like a suffocating shroud. David's breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. His fingers were trembling as he grabbed the nearest chair to steady himself, his knuckles white from the force of his grip. The world felt like it was closing in on him, the walls pressing in from all sides. The chill that had filled the room when the figure had first appeared was now a constant presence, clinging to him like a shadow he couldn't escape. "You can't escape me." The voice, that low, rasping whisper, came again. It was closer this time, no longer a distant sound, but right in his ear, as if the figure were standing beside him. David spun around, but the room was empty. He was alone. Or was he? He had to move. He had to do something, anything to break free from the grip of whatever cursed force had attached itself to him. But his legs felt like lead, his body frozen in place by the overwhelming weight of the presence in the room. He tried to take a step forward, but the moment his foot hit the floor, a sharp, cold sensation ran through his veins, freezing him in his tracks. It was as if the room itself was fighting him, pushing him back, preventing him from escaping. David's thoughts spun in a dizzying blur. He couldn't understand it. How could something so real, so tangible, exist outside of the painting? How could the figure have crossed over from the artwork into his life, into reality? And why was it here? Why was it targeting him? His mind flashed back to the first night he had seen the painting in the thrift store, to the strange pull he had felt toward it, as though something deep within the canvas had called out to him. He had been drawn in, mesmerized by it. And now he was paying the price. The thought made his stomach twist. He had been a fool, a blind fool, to let something so wrong into his life, but there was no undoing it now. "You belong to me now." The voice came again, louder this time, and this time there was no mistaking the malevolence behind it. It was in the room, all around him, a thick, suffocating presence that seemed to press in on him from every direction. He could feel it now, a weight pressing down on his chest, making it harder to breathe. David stumbled backward, his heart racing. His hands flew to his throat, as though he could rip the air free, but the pressure was already too great. He could feel the walls closing in, the floor buckling beneath his feet as the darkness seemed to rise up around him, thick and suffocating. It's here, it's real. He had to get out. He had to leave. But the figure was everywhere. It was in the shadows, in the silence, in the air itself. And its eyes, those unblinking, hollow eyes, were everywhere, watching, waiting for him to make a move. Every time David looked around, it was like he could see those eyes staring at him, just in the periphery of his vision, waiting to devour him whole. A noise behind him made him whirl around, his breath catching in his throat. And then he saw it. The figure was moving again. It wasn't just standing there anymore. It was walking, its long, gangly limbs reaching out, each movement smooth and fluid, like it belonged here, like it was part of this world, part of reality. The painting had become a door, a passageway between worlds, and whatever had been trapped inside was now free. The figure's head tilted to one side as it moved closer, its eyes locked onto David's. The smile it wore stretched impossibly wide, grotesque, a rictus grin that seemed to take up most of its face, leaving behind only a sickening void where its mouth had been. The teeth, sharp, jagged, and yellow, gleamed in the dim light, a grotesque mockery of a human smile. David took an instinctive step backward, but he couldn't escape. The figure's gaze was a force, pulling him forward, pushing him toward it, until there was nowhere left to go. "You called me." The figure's voice rasped, a hiss that sent shivers crawling down David's spine. "And now you'll pay the price." David could feel his heart beating wildly, each thud a drumbeat of impending doom. Sweat poured down his face, his hands slick with panic. He wanted to scream, to call for help, but no sound came. The air in the room felt thick, as if his lungs were full of cement. The figure reached out, its long, bony fingers stretched toward him, the nails curling like claws. It was so close now, so close that David could feel the cold radiating off its skin, feel the unnatural presence that clung to it like a shadow. The fingers brushed against his chest, icy cold, sending a shock of panic through his body. And then, just as quickly, the figure stopped. It didn't touch him, it didn't strike, it only stared. David's breath hitched, his body was frozen, his mind was spinning, But there was one thought that kept repeating in his head, one terrifying truth that he couldn't escape. It's not going to kill me, Keith. The figure was toying with him, savoring his fear. It was a game to it, a sick, twisted game that David was helpless to stop. I can't leave you, can I? David whispered, his voice hoarse, barely audible. The figure's grin widened, impossibly wide, and then it tilted its head in mock contemplation, as though pondering his question. No, you can't. The figure's voice was smooth now, almost pleasant, as if it were making a statement, not a threat. The room seemed to close in on David again, the walls pressing tighter, the air colder, the silence louder. It was overwhelming, suffocating. And all he could do was stand there, trapped in the gaze of the thing that had stepped out of the cursed painting. There was no way out. There was no escape. And the worst part was, he wasn't sure if he wanted to escape anymore. David's breath came in ragged gasps, his chest rising and falling like a bellows caught in a storm. The figure before him grinned wider, impossibly wider, the smile stretching across its face like some grotesque, jagged wound. Its eyes gleamed with a hunger that no human could ever comprehend. It was not just a figure from the painting. It was a force, a malevolent presence that had somehow bled into his world, its thirst for terror, endless. The room felt smaller now. The walls seemed to be pressing in on him, the shadows growing darker, heavier, suffocating him with each passing second. Every breath he took was thick with fear, his own pulse drumming in his ears like a funeral march. He wanted to scream, to run, but the figure's gaze held him in place, frozen, paralyzed. David had no idea how long he had been standing there, locked in this horrible dance of terror. He had no concept of time anymore, of anything beyond the crushing weight of the figure's presence. He wanted to look away, to escape into the safety of his thoughts, but he couldn't. Every part of him was drawn to it, as though it was pulling him in like a magnet, locking him in its web of torment. "I've been waiting." The figure's voice was a rasping whisper, yet it vibrated through David's body, as though the words were written directly onto his skin, crawling beneath his flesh. "I've been waiting for you to see me, waiting for you to bring me here." David felt his legs tremble beneath him, his knees threatening to give way. The figure's words cut through him like a blade, twisting deeper into his mind, unearthing the darkest parts of his soul. "I've been waiting for you to see me." The idea that this thing had been waiting for him specifically chilled him to the bone. David tried to swallow, but his throat was dry, his mouth too full of dread. He had to do something, anything. But what could he do? He had seen the figure move from the painting, had felt the cold grip of its presence in his own world. It was real in a way that nothing should have been. And the horror of that reality began to claw at his insides, threatening to tear him apart. "There's no escape," the figure murmured, its voice now smooth, almost pleasant, like it was telling a secret. "Not for you, not for anyone who calls to me." David's vision blurred, his thoughts fragmented. His head spun with the weight of everything that had happened, the thrift store, the painting, the twisted figure that had emerged from it. And now, here it was, in his home, in his life, slowly unraveling everything he knew. The figure was a virus, spreading its darkness, and David was its host. "No," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Please, stop." But the figure did not stop. It didn't need to. Its presence was like a storm, growing stronger with every passing second. It had claimed him, whether he liked it or not. The horror wasn't just in the figure's appearance. It wasn't even in its words. It was in the undeniable truth that David couldn't escape. "Do you think you can banish me?" The figure took a slow step forward, its long limbs stretching toward David. and the room seemed to stretch with it, the walls warping and twisting, as if the very space around him was bending to the figure's will. "I was here before you, and I will be here long after you are gone." David staggered back, his mind reeling. He had tried so hard to fight this thing, to outsmart it, to undo whatever mistake he had made by buying the cursed painting, but it was clear now. There was no escape. There was no magic word, no hidden ritual, no way to break free from the clutches of the thing that had entered his life. His body hit the wall, his legs buckling beneath him. He was on the ground, staring up at the figure that loomed over him, its eyes locked onto his, unblinking, predatory. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice failed him. He couldn't form the words, couldn't even begin to comprehend what he needed to say to make it stop. It was useless. The figure had already won. And then, for the first time since it had emerged from the painting, the figure did something that made David's heart stop. It reached out. The hand, long and skeletal, curled toward him with deliberate slowness, its fingers twitching as if savoring the moment. The figure's smile widened even further, showing rows upon rows of teeth, teeth that weren't human, teeth that were far too sharp, too jagged, like they were meant to rip through flesh. David's body froze in terror, every muscle locked in place. The hand came closer, inch by agonizing inch, until it hovered above his chest. He could feel the ice-cold air radiating from it, seeping into his skin, filling him with an unbearable cold. "You are mine now," the figure whispered, its breath like the chill of a tomb. "You are mine." David opened his mouth to scream, but nothing came out. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows twisting around him, folding in on themselves like a living thing. The figure's hand finally descended, not on his chest, but on his head. The cold fingers pressed against his skull, the nails sharp and painful, digging into his flesh. And in that moment, David understood. It wasn't just that the figure had crossed over from the painting, it was that the painting itself had changed him. It had altered his reality, twisting the very fabric of his world into something unrecognizable, something filled with horrors and nightmares. David had unwittingly stepped into a new world, a world where there was no escape, where darkness reigned, and where the figure from the painting was the true ruler. With a final crushing force, the figure pulled, and David felt himself falling, sinking, as if the very ground beneath him had given way. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the figure's eyes, dark, endless, and hungry. And then, nothing. It began slowly, like all horrors do. At first, no one took much notice of the sound. It was just a whisper, a hum in the distance, carried on the wind. A few passing townfolk might have thought they heard it, some faint melody rising from the old church near the centre of town, a soft hymn reverberating in the cool evening air. Kind of song you might hear if you were half awake, half dreaming, and had a strange, almost nostalgic memory of being a child at church. But it wasn't until the second evening that the whispers turned into a melody that could not be ignored. Sarah Thompson was the first to notice. She lived at the edge of town in a modest house that looked out over the hills. Her father had been the town's undertaker before he passed, and Sarah had spent her youth among gravestones and quiet churchyards, accustomed to the weight of history, of memory, of those who had passed on. It wasn't until she heard the hymn, faint but undeniable, drifting through the still evening air, that she knew something was wrong. She had heard it before, small hymns at funerals, murmured by the mourners, soft under the weight of grief. But this was different. This was a song that seemed to linger in the night, growing stronger each evening, as if the town itself was waking to something long buried. A heavy pulse in the air, something urgent, yet far off. The kind of sound you only hear when something terrible is on the verge of happening. "Did you hear that?" she asked her husband, Henry, as she closed the kitchen window. Henry didn't look up from his paper. He barely heard her, as was his way. He was content in his small routines, his cup of coffee, his early evening newspaper. "Hear what, dear?" Sarah frowned, stepping closer to the window and listening. There it was again, clearer now, a distant voice raised in unison. A hymn, something from the past, beautiful but unsettling. The church bell tolled softly, almost in answer. "The choir?" she whispered. "It's coming from the church?" "Impossible," Henry grumbled, finally looking up. "The church has been empty for years. The roof is rotting, the place is condemned." But Sarah was sure. "I know what I heard." Henry shook his head dismissively. "Don't go imagining things. The wind plays tricks sometimes." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling. As the days passed, the sound of the unseen choir grew stronger, more distinct. Each evening, the hymn would fill the town's streets, gentle at first, then more insistent, as though begging for attention. And as it filled the air, people began to notice. At first, it was small groups who took to walking past the church after dark, trying to catch a glimpse of who might be singing. Then it was families, curious and wary, walking along the quiet streets, eyes fixed on the silhouette of the old church, standing dark and quiet under the stars. No one spoke about it at first. No one dared, but by the end of the second week, something was beginning to change in the town. It was a small thing, but it was enough. The way people looked at each other, the furtive glances, the quickening of footsteps in the evening air. Some began to wonder quietly at first if it was a trick of the mind, a product of overactive imaginations. And then there were the whispers. There were stories that started circulating. People started asking each other strange questions. "Have you heard it?" they'd ask. "The singing?" And the answer was always the same. Yes, they'd heard it. Yes, they couldn't stop hearing it. The choir was always there, always singing, but no one could see who was performing. It was impossible. The church was abandoned, the windows long shattered, the doors bolted shut. There were no lights inside, no figures, nothing but the chilling, haunting sound that filled the air every evening. Sarah found herself walking to the church that first Friday night, the only night her curiosity could no longer be contained. She had to see for herself. The town was already abuzz, people talking in small circles, gathered by the church, listening. But no one was bold enough to enter. No one was sure what they were hoping to find, or what they feared. Henry had offered no objections. He was used to his wife's eccentric ways, the quiet curiosity that seemed to fuel her. But tonight, there was something different in her eyes, something darker. "I'll only be a moment," she had said before stepping out the door. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor in it, something buried deep within her, something she couldn't quite name. The streets were empty, the air cold and crisp, the shadows long. The church loomed in the distance, its steeple cutting through the night, like a jagged black scar against the dark sky. As Sarah approached, the hymn wrapped around her like a blanket, an eerie comfort. It felt wrong somehow, and yet it was the only sound that filled the town. The closer she got, the louder it became. It wasn't just one voice now, but many, harmonizing together. Beautiful, frightening, too perfect. And then Sarah saw them, or they weren't standing outside the church. They weren't in the windows. They were inside, but they shouldn't have been. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. The doors were bolted, the windows shattered but nailed shut. Yet, through the cracked door, She could see them, pale faces, hollow eyes, swaying in perfect unison. Their lips moved in time to the hymn, but there was no sound, no music. Sarah froze. The figures were dead, she realized. They couldn't be alive. The faces were ghastly like corpses that had been dug up from graves, their eyes milky and lifeless. Their clothes were remnants of old funeral attire, tattered and decayed. The whole scene felt like a waking nightmare, an impossible thing, something no mortal could survive to witness and live to tell about. And yet, Sarah was standing there, eyes locked with the corpses of the dead, their hymn echoing through her bones. Then one of the figures, a tall woman with dark, hollow eyes, turned slowly and looked directly at her. It wasn't a glance, it wasn't a fleeting moment of recognition. It was a stare that bore into her soul. The music stopped. The night was dead silent. Then, through the crack of the old door, she heard a voice, soft, low, but unmistakable. It spoke just a few words, but those words would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. "Join us," it whispered. And just like that, the choir began again. The voice, soft as a whisper, but filled with an undeniable weight, hung in the air like the chill of a grave. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, a wild, frantic rhythm that echoed in her ears. She couldn't move, couldn't look away. "Join us!" The words cut through her like a razor, seeping into her skin and crawling beneath it, until they were lodged in the very marrow of her bones. She had thought she could leave, step back, run from this nightmare. But as she stared at the lifeless faces within the church, as the ghostly hymn started again, the pull of their voices was too much. She wanted to turn away, to shut out the sound, but it was already inside her, and there was no way to silence it. The woman, if she could still be called a woman, continued to stare at her, her eyes milky white, empty of any trace of humanity. But the message was clear. It was as if Sarah were being invited, called, by the choir of the dead, as though they were welcoming her into their fold. The door creaked, and the soft, inhuman voices began to rise again, a chorus of wails, blending with the haunting hymn that filled the air. Sarah could feel the pressure of it, the weight of their gaze, but she wasn't sure how much more she could take. There was no escape, not now, not when they had already seen her. She wasn't sure how much longer she could stand there, frozen in fear, her legs weak with terror. Suddenly a cold wind whipped through the broken door of the church, and the sound of the hymn surged, louder now, sharper. It wasn't just one song anymore, it was many layers of melodies weaving together, building and growing, as if the dead were calling her from different directions. Each voice an individual, each spirit an untold story. The harmonies clashed and merged, a cacophony of despair. The wind outside picked up, rustling through the trees, carrying with it the whispers of those buried in the old cemetery behind the church. It was as though the land itself was alive, alive with the breath of the dead. For a moment, the world around her blurred. Sarah took a step back, her feet unsteady, the ground beneath her shifting like quicksand. Her heart slammed against her ribcage as though it were trying to escape. She stumbled away from the church, her hands trembling as she turned and ran. She could still hear the song in her head, echoing in her mind as she sprinted down the empty street, her pulse in her throat. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She was drowning in the voices of the dead. When she finally reached her home, she slammed the door behind her, locked it, and collapsed against the wood. Henry was still in the living room, reading his paper, as though nothing in the world had changed. But Sarah knew better. The reality had already shifted. What had started as curiosity had now turned into something much worse. "Sarah?" Henry's voice broke through her thoughts. He hadn't even looked up from his paper. "You're shaking. What's wrong?" She couldn't speak. She was too terrified to form the words, too overwhelmed by the memory of the thing she'd seen, the choir of the dead, their eyes empty but filled with need. They had seen her. They had called to her. The door behind her creaked just slightly, as if beckoning her back to the church, back to that place where she had felt the cold embrace of the dead. She shivered, shaking her head to banish the thought. I need to tell you something, Henry. She took a deep breath. There was no going back from this, no denying what she had witnessed. She had to make him understand. She had to make him see. But how could she? How could she make someone believe in something so impossible? Henry looked up from his paper, his brow furrowing. "What's going on, Sarah? You're scaring me." She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing, but her voice still trembled. "I went to the church tonight," she said. "I heard the singing, the choir. I saw them, Henry. I saw the dead." At the mention of the dead, Henry's face paled. He set down the papers slowly, his hands trembling now. "What are you talking about? Sarah, you're not making any sense." "I'm not crazy, Henry," she snapped, her voice rising with the weight of the fear pressing against her chest. "I swear to you I saw them. The figures, the people from the cemetery, they're alive, Henry. They're still here. And they're calling for more." Henry's expression softened, a look of concern passing over his face. But it wasn't the concern she needed. It was the kind of concern you get when someone's mind starts unraveling, when they start saying things that can't be explained. "Sarah, listen to me," he said gently, getting up from his chair. "You're upset. You're exhausted. You've been through a lot lately. Maybe you just need some rest." "No, Henry. I'm telling you, this is real." She took a step forward, desperate. "You don't understand. The voices, they won't stop. The dead—" She choked on the words. "I can't get them out of my head. They're calling for us. They want us." Henry shook his head, stepping closer, his hands resting gently on her arms. "It's okay. It's going to be okay. We'll talk about it tomorrow. Get some sleep." But Sarah couldn't sleep. The voices, the hymn, rang in her head, louder now, sharper. She couldn't close her eyes without seeing the pale, decayed faces of the choir, the way their mouths had opened wide, calling her name. And when she tried to turn away, she saw them again in the corners of her mind, beckoning her with hands that had never felt warmth. She couldn't shut them out. The darkness had already seeped inside her. The next evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, Sarah found herself standing at the window, staring at the church from a distance. The hymn began again, echoing through the streets. It was louder now, closer. She felt the pull again, that irresistible force dragging her back toward the place of the dead. She tried to turn away, tried to ignore it, but the voices, the choir, were inside her now. They had woven themselves into her thoughts, into her very soul. And she knew that sooner or later the town would be drawn into it too. The dead would not rest until they had claimed every last soul. "Join us." The invitation was still there, and this time Sarah couldn't refuse. It was around midnight when the voices grew unbearable. The entire town could hear it now, the haunting hymn, drifting from the old church, curling its tendrils into every corner of the darkened streets. Sarah stood by the window, her eyes wide, locked onto the silhouette of the church against the moonlit sky. The wind howled through the trees as if carrying the sound of the choir, amplifying their call. The voices bled into the night, sweet yet filled with something dark, something wrong. And it wasn't just the sound anymore, it was the feeling. The air felt heavy, as though the town itself were breathing in time with the hymn. The earth below seemed to hum with each note. Sarah knew deep down that it was not the wind, it was not a trick of the mind. This was something much worse, something ancient, and she had heard it, felt it. She closed her eyes, but the voices continued, and when she tried to push them away to silence them, all she could hear was the sound of their hollow, mournful notes. "Join us!" The whisper came again, this time inside her mind. The voice, one of the many that filled the choir, wrapped itself around her thoughts like a noose. She could feel it tightening, feel it pulling her in. And in that moment, she knew it wasn't a simple song. It was a summoning, a call to the living to join the dead. She had tried to explain it to Henry, but he wouldn't listen. He still didn't understand. He had told her she needed to rest, that she was imagining things. But she knew, deep in her bones, that it was real. Church, the cemetery, the voices, they were all part of the same dark force, bound together by something far beyond their comprehension. The next morning, Sarah didn't sleep. She couldn't. Even the slightest hint of the hymn would start up again in her mind, as though the voices had settled there, making themselves at home. They were not content to stay in the church anymore. They had followed her. They were in every creaking floorboard of her home, in every rustling shadow outside her window. She could no longer avoid the truth. There was something wrong about the church, about the people buried there. The way the ground seemed to shift beneath the cemetery. The way the church never seemed to decay, even though it had stood for over a century. The way the figures in the windows always seemed to be watching. And that face, the woman with hollow eyes and a mouth that never stopped singing. She couldn't shake the image of her. Sarah had seen the woman's mouth open wide, her lips stretched in a scream that wasn't a scream. It was a song, a hymn, a call. And she knew with an awful certainty that the woman was no longer human. She was something else, something lost, something trapped in the earth, waiting to drag others down with her. "I have to go back," Sarah whispered to herself. The thought came unbidden, rising from some place deep inside her. She didn't know how she could still be thinking clearly with the chaos in her head, but it was undeniable. It was a compulsion now, a need to understand what was happening. The more she resisted, the more the voices pulled, and so Sarah made her decision. That night, she walked back to the church alone. The sky was thick with clouds, hiding the moon behind a blanket of darkness. The wind had stopped, leaving the night eerily silent, save for the far-off hymn that drifted through the air, as though it had always been there, waiting for her return. Each step toward the church felt heavier than the last, the ground beneath her feet growing colder with every passing moment. She could see the faint outline of the church in the distance, the silhouette of its steeple reaching toward the sky like an outstretched finger. The closer she got, the more she felt the pull, compelling, dragging her forward. Her chest tightened with every step, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't turn away now, not when she was so close to the answers, not when the dead were calling to her so loudly. When she reached the churchyard, she stopped at the entrance, her heart racing in her chest. The old wrought-iron gates groaned as they swayed in the wind. She pushed them open with a creak and stepped inside. The air was still, but there was something heavy in the atmosphere, as though the ground itself had been waiting for her. Her eyes wandered over the gravestones, their inscriptions worn by time, their names long forgotten. The church stood tall before her, silent, ominous. She felt an icy draft swirling around her legs, tugging at her dress as though it were a warning. But she didn't heed it. She stepped forward. The doors to the church were ajar, dark inside, still. And the hymn.
It was louder now, too loud to ignore, reverberating through her skull, sinking into her skin, thrumming in the marrow of her bones. She entered, her footsteps echoing against the cold stone floor. Her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and the faint glow of candles revealed the shapes of the pews, empty, abandoned, but filled with a presence nonetheless. The altar loomed at the far end of the church, and there, standing in the shadows, was the woman. The one who had called to her. The one who had whispered her name. She was standing at the altar, staring at Sarah with those empty eyes, her mouth moving in perfect harmony with the hymn that filled the air. But the hymn wasn't the same anymore. The voices were clearer now, more distinct. Sarah could make out words, her name among them. Sarah. The voice was soft, but filled with an overwhelming sense of command, a desire to draw her closer. The woman's lips parted, and she stepped forward, one slow, deliberate movement after another. Her body was emaciated, her skin stretched tight over bones, but it was her eyes, those hollow, milky eyes, that held Sarah in place. Come, join us. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her hands shaking as she reached for the nearest pew to steady herself. She didn't know if she could move. She didn't know if she should, but there was something about the woman's voice, the way it seemed to sink into her very soul, that kept her rooted to the spot. And then, in the far corner of the church, another figure appeared. A man, pale, transparent. His face twisted in agony, his mouth open in a silent scream, but still he sang. His voice mingled with the others, joining the chorus of the dead. One by one, more figures emerged from the shadows, stepping out of the pews, their forms thin and translucent, but their voices strong, their hands reaching out towards Sarah. They were all singing now, the souls of those buried here, those who had died so violently, so wrongly. The choir had found its next victim.
The sound of the choir was deafening now. It filled the church, the town, the very air that Sarah breathed. Every inch of her body was saturated with the haunting hymns, the voices intertwining in a maddening symphony of agony and longing. She could feel the cold breath of the souls who sang, their bony fingers brushing against her skin, leaving behind a trail of chill that seemed to freeze her very thoughts. "Join us," they whispered in unison, their voices rising in pitch, pushing against her sanity. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest, but she couldn't move. Not out of fear, but because she felt an odd sense of compulsion. The song was no longer just an auditory experience. It was inside her mind, deep within her soul, pulling her closer to them. She could feel the pull of the dead reaching out to her, and she understood this wasn't just a song. It was an invitation to join them in their eternal, sorrowful choir. She glanced over at the figures that stood before her, rising from the pews, their hollow eyes fixed upon her. There were no words left in her throat to scream. They were all moving now, as if guided by the song itself, their bodies impossibly thin, almost skeletal, with skin stretched tight over their bones. The woman, the one who had first sung to her, stood at the front, her mouth open wide, singing louder than the rest. Her voice was like a whisper at first, almost inaudible, but now it was the center of everything, the core of the song that seemed to echo in the very marrow of Sarah's bones. "Join us." The woman's eyes met Sarah's, and for a brief moment she could see the terror that still lingered there. This woman, once a living, breathing person, was now just another lost soul, trapped in this cursed place. Her expression twisted, as though she were pleading silently for Sarah to turn and run, but it was too late for her. It was too late for all of them.
"Please, don't
Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse, barely a breath above the song. She didn't know if she was talking to the woman, to the souls, or to herself. She wanted to run. She needed to run, but her body refused to move. The song was too powerful. It was like a spider's web wrapping around her, pulling her in deeper. Sarah tried to look away, to focus on anything else, but her eyes were drawn back to the altar, where a new figure had appeared. A man. He was tall, with wide, hollow eyes, and a grin that stretched unnaturally wide across his face, his teeth jagged and yellowed with age. He didn't sing. Instead, he just stood there, watching her with an intensity that sent ice through her veins. She felt his gaze like a weight, like something oppressive, something that demanded her attention. She tried to tear her eyes away, but his presence was too powerful. It was like his stare was reaching deep into her mind, unraveling her thoughts, replacing them with his own. The voice came again, louder, sharper this time, cutting through the air like a blade.
Join us. Be a part of our song. Forever. The words slithered into her mind, their meaning twisting and warping into something dark and inescapable. She understood now. They weren't just asking, they were taking. They were using the song to drag her down into their eternal torment. Her breathing quickened as she struggled against the rising panic, but there was nothing she could do. The song, their song, had her. The dead were rising from the shadows, their skeletal hands reaching out to her, their mouths stretched wide in eerie, silent screams. Their bodies were warped, twisted by death, but their voices, they were pure. Their voices filled the air, their melodies weaving together in a maddening chorus that drowned out everything else. She could feel the presence of the man now, the one whose gaze never left her, moving toward her with slow, deliberate steps. He was no longer just a figure in the distance. He was here, close, too close. The chill of his touch was just a breath away from her skin. And then, as if in response to his approach, the other souls moved as one. Their voices grew louder, more insistent, and Sarah felt the pull in her chest, an unbearable force that threatened to crush her. The dead wanted her. They needed her to join their chorus, their eternal suffering. The man reached out for her. His cold fingers brushed her arm, and the sensation was like a jolt of lightning running through her veins. She flinched, but there was nowhere to retreat, no escape. The room spun around her as the figures closed in, surrounding her. The woman, the one who had once sung to her, was now crying out, her voice breaking free from the song, her scream echoing through the church like a warning. But the other souls ignored her. They didn't care. Their focus was on Sarah now. And then, in the corner of her vision, something caught her eye. It was the gravestone outside, the one that had always seemed to loom over the churchyard, a symbol etched into the stone, glowing faintly in the moonlight. It wasn't just a grave marker, it was something else, something ancient. The hymn is the key, the thought, struck Sarah like a thunderclap. The song had power, but so did the gravestones. They were all connected. The souls, the graveyard, church. The dead were not simply singing, they were trapped within the cemetery. And they were using the song to claim new victims. Her heart pounded in her chest as the realization hit her. The woman with the hollow eyes, the man with the twisted grin, they were not trying to drag her into the choir. They were trying to warn her, but there was no way to escape, no way to free herself, not without paying the price. The man stepped forward, his mouth opening in a silent scream, his eyes glinting with the same hunger that had burned in the others. He was close now, too close. Join us. And Sarah, her heart filled with terror, whispered into the darkness. No.
The room felt as though it was closing in around Sarah. The choir's voices, once faint and distant, now filled the space with such intensity that they seemed to consume the very air. She could taste the bitter cold notes of their song in her throat, as if they were pushing into her body, into her mind. The room was no longer the church she had stepped into. It was something darker, something alive, pulsing with an ancient hunger. The man with the twisted grin moved closer. His breath was icy against her skin, his eyes wide and unblinking. The rest of the choir followed suit, their thin, hollow bodies closing in around her. They all reached for her, their bony hands extending from the darkened pews, their mouths moving in perfect unison, singing the song with a desperation that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. "Join us!" they sang, their voices harmonizing with a chill that sunk deeper than flesh. It wasn't a request anymore, it was a command. Her pulse quickened. She couldn't breathe. The weight of their cold stare, the suffocating pressure of the voices pressing in from every direction, it was all too much. She felt herself trembling, her legs too weak to hold her up any longer. The church swayed, and the altar in front of her seemed to distort, warping as if it were made from some kind of fluid, as though the building itself was breathing. It wasn't just the souls that were hungry. The place itself had a hunger, a deep, gnawing void. Her eyes locked on the gravestone outside, through the cracked, stained windows. It glowed again, faintly, like a beacon. The symbol etched into the stone seemed to shift with the rhythm of the song, almost as if it were alive, twisting and pulling her gaze back to it, luring her like a moth to a flame. She had to get out. She had to make it stop. But where was the escape? There was no way out. Sarah's eyes darted frantically around the church, searching for anything that could break the cycle. The choir continued, their song louder now, wrapping around her like chains. But then a sound, something different, cracked through the symphony, a high-pitched, sharp scream. It was the woman, the one who had first sung to her. Her face contorted in agony as she tried to break free from the thrall of the others, her voice screeching in defiance. But it was too late. The figures around her closed in, and she was swallowed by the dark, her body dissolving into the void with the others. "Join us!" the voice of the man repeated, now deep and guttural, as he raised his hand to grab her. His fingers hovered just inches away from her arm. And then something inside Sarah snapped. There was a fire, a spark of rage, deep in her chest that had been smouldering since she first heard the song. It wasn't the song that could control her. It wasn't the souls. She had something they did not will. She clenched her fists, feeling the surge of energy rush through her, as though the very walls of the church were amplifying her fear and her anger. With a guttural scream, Sarah pushed herself forward, breaking through the circle of trapped souls, her body moving on pure instinct, ignoring the weight of their songs that tried to smother her. She sprinted toward the altar, her breath ragged in her throat, her footsteps unsteady but fast, faster than she ever thought possible. The voices screamed behind her, their hymn distorted by her defiance. It felt as though the air itself was rejecting her escape, but she pushed on, her heart slamming against her ribs. She reached the altar. Her hands flew to the gravestone, her fingers tracing the symbol on the stone, the same symbol she had seen through the window. As her touch made contact, a crack of light shot through her fingertips, illuminating the graveyard outside, the light so blinding it threatened to burn her. The song grew frantic behind her, the choir howling in agony as though they sensed what she was about to do. But Sarah didn't stop. Her mind flashed with images of the woman who had once tried to warn her, of the townspeople she had seen walking by the church earlier that day, oblivious to the horror that waited within these walls. She couldn't let this happen to anyone else. The symbol on the gravestone burned brighter, and for the briefest moment she felt it, a connection. The souls, the church, the cemetery, the song, it was all tied together, all part of a curse that fed on the living, feeding off their fear, their souls, their flesh. With all the strength she could muster, Sarah pushed against the gravestone, feeling it shift beneath her touch. The light flared up one final time, and she felt her body snap back as though the earth itself were rejecting her. The choir's song halted. The air grew still. The silence that followed was deafening. And then, as quickly as it had come, the church returned to its normal silent state. Sarah collapsed to the ground, her legs too weak to hold her. She blinked, trying to gather her bearings. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The air was thick with the scent of dust and mildew. The church seemed unchanged, as though the events of the night had never happened at all. She dared to look behind her. There was no one. The choir was gone. The souls had disappeared. The shadows no longer clung to the walls. But in her heart, Sarah knew this wasn't over. The curse had been pushed back, but it had not been broken. The souls would return, and the song would rise again. Sarah stood, her legs shaking, but she knew she had won this round. She had fought back, and she would be ready when the time came again. For now she walked slowly out of the church, leaving the gravestone behind. As she stepped out into the quiet night, the song lingered in the air, faint like a warning. She could still hear it, the echoes, the whisper of a hymn that would never be truly silenced.